Welcome back to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you listen to my stories to fall asleep. So lay down, relax, and let's get started. When Eleanor Ravenswood inherited Wraithmore Manor, she knew little of her family's haunted past. Growing up, she had been shielded from tales of her ancestors' strange dealings and misfortunes. But from the moment she stepped onto the property, a gnawing dread gripped her, an inexplicable fear that made the very air seem charged with something dark and unnatural. She chalked it up to her overactive imagination, for she was, after all, finally home. The manor itself was a Gothic behemoth, towering over the foggy moors with an oppressive air of decay and grandeur. It had been left untouched for nearly a century, frozen in time, still holding relics and remnants of the family's past. Eleanor had always found history fascinating, and the manor, with its winding corridors and ominous staircases, was a historian's dream come true. But as night fell on her first day, an eerie feeling began to settle in. Eleanor explored cautiously, a candle flickering in her hand, casting dancing shadows along the walls. The house creaked and groaned as if it were alive, and she could swear the shadows moved of their own accord, reaching for her with greedy, spectral fingers. In one of the upper bedrooms, she found an ancient painting, draped in a sheet, and carefully lifted the cover to reveal a portrait of a woman with piercing eyes that seemed to follow her with an unsettling intelligence. Her mother had always mentioned their family history in fragments, often mentioning an ancestor who had disappeared. But Eleanor had never seen a portrait of her, until now. It was that night Eleanor heard the first whispers. In the deepest hours of night, when the world was silent and still, a faint voice drifted through the halls, a whisper so soft she thought she imagined it. She held her breath, listening. Eleanor, it called, soft but insistent. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was the house settling or the wind. But as the night wore on, the voice grew louder, filling the silence with a persistent hum that tugged at her mind, urging her to follow. The next day, Eleanor found herself drawn to the library, an expansive room lined floor to ceiling with dusty tomes, each one holding secrets that had been hidden for generations. As she wandered the shelves, her fingers brushed over a particularly ancient, leather-bound book. Its title had been worn away by time, and when she opened it, a chill ran down her spine. Inside, she found page after page of her family's dark history, accounts of deals made with forces she could hardly comprehend, of disappearances, of madness that seeped into the Ravenswood bloodline. There was mention of a hidden room, a place known only as the Vault, rumored to be where the family's darkest relics were kept. But the book also hinted at a curse, one that had been placed on the Ravenswoods by a scorned lover who had vanished into the moors centuries ago. Her great-great-grandmother, Lady Cordelia Ravenswood, was said to have dabbled in dark magic, a practitioner of forbidden rites that were only whispered about in hushed tones. She had supposedly angered the spirits of the moors, leaving the family forever cursed to live with the specters they had disturbed. Eleanor's heart pounded as she read, feeling the weight of her ancestors' sins pressed down upon her. She had come to Wraithmore Manor to find herself, but she was beginning to fear that the person she was becoming wasn't truly herself. Determined to find the hidden room, Eleanor spent the next week scouring the house. She traced her hands over every wall, checking for secret panels or hidden passages. Her search finally led her to a dusty, forgotten alcove behind the library, where she found a narrow staircase spiraling downward into the depths of the manor. As she descended, the air grew colder, and an almost suffocating silence enveloped her. At the bottom, she found a thick, iron door etched with symbols she could not read. With a trembling hand, she pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and thick with an indescribable sense of malevolence. Shelves lined the walls, filled with strange artifacts. A cracked mirror, a small porcelain doll with one eye missing, and a stack of letters, yellowed with age. As she thumbed through the letters, her eyes widened. They were written by Lady Cordelia herself, detailing her descent into madness and obsession with an ancient being she referred to as the Watcher. One passage caught Eleanor's eye, chilling her to the bone. The Watcher came to me in dreams, showing me visions of the other side. His eyes are endless, a void that sees all and consumes all. I have given him what he asks, and in return, he has granted me knowledge and power. But I fear the cost, for he whispers to me still, even when I am awake. From that night on, Eleanor's dreams were filled with haunting visions. She saw glimpses of the moors, shrouded in a supernatural mist that seemed alive, pulsating with an unnatural energy. Figures moved in the fog, shadowy forms that reached for her, their hollow eyes filled with hunger. One night, as she tossed and turned, she was jolted awake by a soft tapping sound. Her heart raced, and she sat up, straining to hear. Tap, tap, tap. The sound seemed to come from inside the walls, creeping closer, as if something or someone was crawling within. As she listened, the tapping grew louder, morphing into a scratching, scraping sound that seemed to surround her. Panicked, she leapt from the bed and fled down the hall, the sound following her, filling the corridors with an unrelenting, bone-chilling persistence. Finally, she reached the main hall, breathless and trembling, only to find the portrait of the woman, the same one she had seen her first night, hanging there, her painted eyes blazing with unnatural fury. And this time, the woman seemed to smile. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor's grip on reality began to slip. She barely slept, haunted by the feeling that something watched her every move, lurking in the corners of her vision. She tried to leave the manor, but every time she approached the gate, an invisible force seemed to pull her back, whispering to her, lulling her into a trance. Desperate, she turned back to the book she had found in the library. She began to read the rituals inscribed within, drawn to a spell that promised to reveal the identity of the Watcher. But as she began the incantation, a darkness settled over her, filling her mind with voices, each one echoing her name, over and over again until it became a cacophony of madness. That night, as the final words left her lips, a figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes like endless pits of darkness, reflecting no light, only an abyss. It reached out to her with skeletal hands, and Eleanor felt her soul being pulled from her body, her consciousness fading as she stared into the black, consuming void of the Watcher. The last thing she heard was its voice, low and menacing, filling her mind with an ancient promise. "You are mine, Eleanor," as they all were. Years later, new residents moved into the manor, oblivious to the horrors that lay in its walls. But the moors still whispered, and on quiet nights, those who dared venture near could still hear Eleanor's voice, calling from within, begging for release. And those who listened too closely found themselves trapped, ensnared by the same curse, for the Watcher was always hungry, and the Ravenswood family was far from finished. In time, Eleanor became another shadow, another voice calling from the dark, and the cycle continued, a living nightmare that would never end. The Ravenswoods remain haunted, their lineage forever bound to Wraithmore Manor. Each generation is marked by tragedy, each descendant succumbing to the lure of the Watcher, and each one joins the chorus of voices that haunt the moors, trapped in a realm of eternal darkness. And even now, the townsfolk warn travelers to stay away from Wraithmore, for those who listen too closely may find themselves lost, hearing the same whispered invitation, "Come to me, come to the shadows." For centuries, the secluded village of Dread Hollow existed only in whispers and rumors, a place on the edge of Blackthorn Woods that locals warned travelers never to visit. There were stories of disappearances, of strangers who came seeking shelter only to be swallowed by the village and never seen again, of strange rites performed in secret, and a spirit, known only as the Veiled Lady, who roamed the woods and the village under cover of darkness. This was a village marred by tragedy, where curses ran as deep as the roots of the ancient trees. But curiosity drove Emma there. She'd read about the village, the hauntings, and the warnings that surrounded it in all the old tales, and was drawn to them like a moth to a flame, convinced she'd find nothing but superstition. Yet, as she neared the village on a cold autumn evening, a thick, unnatural fog began to drift over the road, consuming the headlights of her car and reducing the world outside to a wall of impenetrable gray. Her heart raced as she tightened her grip on the wheel. The closer she got to the village, the thicker the fog grew, curling around her car like ghostly fingers. Finally, her car rolled to a stop at what appeared to be the outskirts of Dread Hollow. The village lay silent and still, shrouded in mist so dense that even the few lights from nearby windows seemed to barely flicker through it. She stepped out, her footsteps crunching against the damp gravel as she took in her surroundings. The houses were small, squat, and huddled together as though seeking comfort. Every door was bolted shut, windows covered with thick, dark curtains that seemed to muffle the very light. Despite the silence, the air hummed with tension, as if the village itself were watching her, waiting. She took a few tentative steps forward, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of life. But what she saw instead were strange symbols etched into doorways, fences, and even on the ground beneath her feet. Symbols she didn't recognize, drawn in jagged lines and loops that seemed to spiral inward, drawing her attention and making her feel dizzy, as though something unseen were tugging at her mind. She turned her head sharply, certain she'd heard footsteps. The sound was faint, soft, as if someone were trailing her. She spun around, but the street behind her was empty, just the ever-present fog swallowing the path. She called out, her voice sounding weak and thin, but no reply came. Ignoring her rising panic, she continued further into the village, heading toward a central square she could just make out through the mist. And that was when she saw it. A lone building, taller and more foreboding than the others, its walls stained with age and ivy creeping over its facade, seeming to pull the building down into the earth. A decaying wooden sign, barely readable, revealed it to be the village chapel. Something about it felt wrong. Its sharp, gabled roof jutting into the mist, its boarded windows that hid whatever horrors lay inside. She shivered as a chill ran down her spine, but something compelled her forward, an invisible pull she couldn't resist. As she moved closer to the chapel doors, she noticed the faint outline of a figure standing in the doorway, cloaked in shadow. Her heart pounded, and every instinct screamed at her to run, yet she felt rooted to the spot. The figure lifted a thin, pale hand and beckoned her forward. Its movement was slow, deliberate, a silent command she couldn't defy. She moved closer, her body unwillingly following the figure's silent summons. With each step, the air grew colder, and her breaths became shallow gasps as she approached. Finally, she stood before the chapel door. The figure, now gone, had disappeared into the darkness within. She reached out and, with trembling fingers, pushed the heavy wooden door open. It groaned, a low, echoing sound that seemed to travel through the entire village, stirring some unseen presence around her. Inside, the air was thick and damp, cloying with the smell of old wax, wet stone, and something foul and earthy. Weak candles burned along the walls, barely casting enough light to see beyond a few steps. Taking a shaky breath, she ventured deeper, her every movement slow, cautious, and filled with dread. In the center of the room, she spotted an altar shrouded in dust and shadows. On it lay a rotting, ancient book with brittle, yellowed pages filled with the same jagged symbols she'd seen outside. Beside the book was a glass case containing a tattered, lace veil that looked as though it hadn't been touched in centuries. Its intricate lace pattern seemed woven with strange symbols that sent a chill through her as she stared at them. She felt compelled to reach out to the veil, but something about the case, the way the lace seemed to shimmer as though alive, rooted her in place. The legend of the veiled lady flashed through her mind. A spirit said to be bound to the village after a failed wedding rite. A soul trapped forever in mourning and searching for the life she'd lost. The veiled lady, she realized, wasn't just a ghost haunting the village. She was a remnant of an ancient pact, a being that demanded sacrifice in exchange for the village's safety, an endless tribute of souls to keep her from devouring all of Dread Hollow. It was then that Emma noticed her own reflection in the glass, and what she saw made her blood run cold. It wasn't her face. In the reflection, her features had changed to a hollow, sunken version of herself, her eyes vacant, as if staring into the void. Her reflection wore the veil, and the lace clung to her face, pulling her skin tight, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. She stumbled backward, her breath shallow, but as she moved, the shadows around her seemed to shift and pulse, closing in as though to hold her in place. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw the pale figure again, hovering at the edge of the candlelight. Its eyes were hollow and dark, staring directly at her, yet somehow lifeless and filled with an infinite sorrow. It moved toward her, one slow step at a time, extending its hand toward her. Before she could scream, she felt a chill seep into her skin, as if icy fingers were pressing into her bones, rooting her to the spot. A voice whispered in her ear, soft but filled with an ancient malice. "Join me," it breathed, each word dripping with a hunger that seemed to pierce her soul. She tried to move, to run, but her legs were frozen, her body paralyzed by an invisible force. She could feel something wrapping around her, a weight pressing down, as if she were sinking into the floor, her vision dimming as the veil in the case began to pulse with an eerie, spectral glow. Her vision blurred, and the last thing she saw was the figure lowering the veil over her face, its icy lace pressing against her skin, sealing her fate. When the villagers emerged from their homes at dawn, they found the door to the chapel wide open and the veil missing, though Emma's car remained parked just outside the village. They whispered among themselves, their faces pale, for they knew what had happened. Another sacrifice had been claimed. From that day forward, it was said that the spirit of the veiled lady grew stronger, and anyone who dared to enter the village alone would feel her presence, a shadowy figure in the mist, with her pale, empty eyes fixed upon them, beckoning them deeper into the darkness. Now, locals say the Veiled Lady is no longer confined to the chapel but roams the village and the edges of Blackthorn Woods, her sorrowful whispers heard on quiet nights, her icy fingers felt by anyone who lingers too long, urging them to join her among the lost souls of Dread Hollow. In the heart of the Cimmerian Pines, an old, abandoned mansion loomed like a specter of its former self. Known as Blackwood House, it had stood for centuries, nestled deep in the forest, forgotten by the world beyond. Its tall, foreboding towers were cracked and crumbling, and ivy had claimed the outer walls, wrapping around them like chains. Local legends claimed the place was cursed, haunted by the spirit of a woman named Lillian, who was said to wander the halls at night, forever searching for something she had lost. It was said she had vanished without a trace one winter night, and ever since, anyone who dared enter Blackwood House would hear her soft, mournful voice calling from the shadows. Elise had heard the stories since she was a child, and she'd always scoffed at them, convinced that the house was nothing more than an old ruin. But when her grandfather passed away, leaving her the deed to the property, she decided to visit Blackwood House herself, more out of curiosity than anything else. She arrived on a cold, gray afternoon, the sky thick with clouds that threatened snow. As she approached, the air seemed to grow colder, and a sense of unease crept over her. The silence was unnatural, as if the entire forest held its breath. She brushed it off as nerves and pushed open the massive front door, which groaned on its hinges, echoing through the empty halls. Inside, the mansion was even darker than she'd imagined. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick and stale, carrying the faint scent of decayed wood and something else she couldn't identify, something sharp and metallic. The grand foyer opened up to a sweeping staircase that seemed to disappear into the darkness above. Shadows clung to every corner, and as she looked around, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls themselves were watching her, hiding secrets that had been buried for centuries. She took a deep breath and began her exploration, her footsteps echoing in the hollow silence. As she wandered the halls, Elise noticed strange details about the house. There were portraits lining the walls, each one more unsettling than the last. The people in the paintings had hollow eyes, their faces frozen in expressions of grief or rage, and she could swear their gazes followed her as she moved. At the end of one corridor, she came across a door that looked different from the others, made of a dark wood that seemed almost untouched by time. She reached out to open it, but as soon as her fingers brushed the handle, a chill shot through her, and she pulled her hand back instinctively. It was then that she heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper that seemed to come from behind the door. "Help me." The voice was faint, almost childlike, and yet it carried a desperation that sent a shiver down her spine. Elise tried to tell herself it was just the wind, but something about the voice lingered in her mind, as if it had been etched into her thoughts. Against her better judgment, she pushed open the door. Inside was a small, dimly lit room with faded wallpaper and a single, dust-covered mirror hanging on the wall. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, the sound reverberating through the silence. Her heart raced, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. She turned to open the door, but it wouldn't budge, as though something on the other side held it firmly shut. Turning back to the room, she noticed something strange about the mirror. It didn't reflect the room as it was. Instead, it showed an image of the room as it might have looked 100 years ago, with rich, vibrant wallpaper and an ornate carpet covering the floor. And in the reflection, she saw a woman standing behind her, a woman with pale skin, hollow eyes, and long, dark hair that framed her face like a shadow. The woman's mouth opened, but instead of words, a low, guttural moan escaped her lips, filling the room with a sound that was both human and inhuman, as if it carried centuries of pain. Elise stumbled back, her pulse pounding as she tried to look away from the mirror, but her eyes seemed glued to it, unable to tear themselves from the figure behind her. The woman reached out a hand, her fingers long and skeletal, stretching toward Elise's shoulder. A surge of panic shot through her, and she spun around, only to find the room empty. But as she turned back to the mirror, the woman was still there, her hand now pressed against the glass, her hollow eyes filled with a strange, pleading look. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice thick with sorrow. Elise felt a pang of sympathy, though she couldn't explain why. There was something hauntingly familiar about the woman's face, as if she'd seen her before, in a half-remembered dream or an old photograph. She backed out of the room, her heart racing, but as she turned to leave, she found that the hallway she'd come from was gone. In its place was a narrow, winding corridor that stretched into darkness. Every instinct told her to turn back, to find another way, but something compelled her forward, as if an unseen force was guiding her deeper into the house. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air growing colder with each step. Shadows flickered along the walls, and she could swear she heard footsteps echoing just behind her, though every time she turned, the corridor was empty. After what felt like an eternity, she found herself in a grand, dimly lit ballroom, its once beautiful decorations now faded and tattered. The air was heavy with the scent of old perfume and something darker, something that smelled of earth and decay. In the center of the room stood a figure, her back turned to Elise. The woman's hair was long and dark, just like the figure in the mirror, and she wore a flowing, tattered gown that brushed the floor like mist. Elise felt her heart pound as the woman slowly turned to face her, revealing the same hollow eyes and sorrowful expression she had seen in the mirror. The woman stepped closer, her gaze fixed on Elise, and as she moved, her feet didn't touch the floor, as though she were gliding rather than walking. Her hand reached out, trembling, and she spoke in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. "He took it from me, my heart, my life." Her words trailed off into silence, and Elise felt a cold hand press against her own chest, just above her heart. A pain shot through her, sharp and sudden, as though something were being pulled from inside her. Elise tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself growing weaker, as if her very life were being drained from her. The woman's eyes grew darker, her gaze filled with an insatiable hunger. "You must stay. You belong here now," the woman whispered, her hand pressing harder against Elise's chest. In a final, desperate attempt, Elise tore herself away, stumbling back and gasping for breath. She turned to flee, but the ballroom had vanished, replaced by an endless, twisting labyrinth of corridors, each one darker and colder than the last. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she wandered through the maze, her strength fading with every step. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and she could feel the house closing in around her, trapping her in its clutches. Finally, she collapsed, her vision dimming, and as darkness claimed her, she heard the faint, mournful whisper of the woman's voice echoing in her mind. "You belong to Blackwood now." When the townsfolk came looking for Elise days later, they found the mansion empty, its rooms just as cold and decayed as before. But from that day on, those brave enough to venture into Blackwood House spoke of a new voice among the whispers, a voice filled with fear and sorrow, a voice calling for help, lost forever in the shadows. High in the mountains, isolated from civilization, there stood an old mining town called Greystone Hollow. Decades ago, it had thrived during the Silver Rush, but after a series of mysterious deaths, it was abandoned overnight, left to decay under the relentless winter snows. Local legends told of the miner's curse, a haunting that was said to plague any who dared venture into Greystone Hollow. They said the mountains held a power that corrupted the soul, and that the darkness within the mine had driven the last of its workers mad. No one had dared enter the hollow for years, until Victor decided he'd find out the truth for himself. Victor had always been drawn to ghost towns, the relics of forgotten history, and the stories they held. Greystone Hollow, with its whispered curses and stories of restless spirits, was exactly the kind of mystery he'd been looking for. He set out one cold autumn day, hiking up the rocky trails with only a flashlight, a map, and a small satchel of supplies. The trees grew sparse as he ascended, the mountain's rocky terrain swallowing the trail until he found himself standing at the edge of the hollow. It was nearly dusk, and the fading light bathed the town in an eerie glow. Broken buildings and rusted machinery lay scattered across the area like bones, remnants of a forgotten life. The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it a faint, metallic scent. He shivered, feeling an unexpected chill creep up his spine, but he pushed it aside. With each step, he felt as if the mountain itself were watching him, waiting. As he walked through the town, Victor noticed strange things. Faint footprints in the dust that seemed fresh, despite the years of abandonment. Doors slightly ajar, as if someone had passed through recently. Windows that seemed to reflect shadows even when no one stood near them. He brushed these off as tricks of his imagination, the result of his own anticipation building into paranoia. But then, he reached the mouth of the mine, the place the townsfolk had called the heart of the hollow, and something in him hesitated. The entrance was a yawning void, surrounded by weathered boards and chains that had long since rusted through. A cold, metallic scent seeped from within, thicker and sharper than the faint traces in the town itself. For a moment, he considered turning back, but curiosity pushed him forward. He took a deep breath, turned on his flashlight, and stepped into the darkness. Inside, the air was thick and stale, pressing in around him as though the mountain itself were swallowing him whole. His footsteps echoed off the narrow walls, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe at the edges of his light. Old equipment lay scattered along the floor, half buried in the dirt, and the walls were scarred with claw-like marks that he guessed were the desperate strikes of pickaxes. As he ventured deeper, he began to notice something strange. Whispers, faint and fragmented, drifting from deeper within the mine. At first, he told himself it was the wind, or perhaps the creak of old beams settling. But as he moved further, the voices grew louder, more distinct, like a chorus of men muttering just out of sight. His flashlight flickered, and his heart raced as he tried to ignore the feeling that he was being watched. He rounded a corner and stumbled into a large, open cavern. The walls of the cavern were lined with strange markings, crude, jagged symbols scratched into the stone. They seemed to pulse in the darkness, and as he stared, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He took a step forward, his eyes catching a glimmer of something buried in the dirt. Crouching down, he reached for it and unearthed a rusted silver locket. Its surface was tarnished, but when he opened it, he found a photograph inside, a faded image of a woman with haunted eyes, staring out as if she were looking directly at Hai. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the whispers turned into a low, anguished moan that seemed to come from all around him. The walls of the cavern began to shake, dust and small rocks tumbling from above, and he felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his chest, as if an icy hand had reached into him, gripping his heart. He staggered back, clutching the locket, but when he looked down, it had vanished from his hand. Panic surged through him, and he turned to leave, but the entrance to the cavern had disappeared. In its place was a wall of solid rock, as if the mountain had closed in on itself, trapping him. He shone his flashlight around, desperate to find another way out, but the beam only revealed more jagged symbols carved into the walls, symbols that seemed to twist and writhe as he stared at them. And then he saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, pale and hollow-eyed, their faces frozen in expressions of fear and anguish. They wore tattered clothing, the remnants of miners' uniforms, and their mouths moved silently, as though crying out in pain. They began to close in, their hands outstretched, and he felt the icy grip tighten around his chest. He backed away, his heart pounding, but the figures kept advancing, their hollow eyes fixed on him with a hunger that defied understanding. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat, and he felt his vision blur as a wave of exhaustion washed over him. The last thing he saw was the face of one of the miners, mere inches from his own, its mouth twisted into a ghastly smile as it whispered, "Join us, the mountain hungers." When Victor's friends came searching for him days later, they found no trace of him, only his flashlight lying at the entrance to the mine, flickering weakly. They say that on quiet nights, if you listen closely near the mouth of Greystone Hollow, you can still hear the faint whispers of the miners, their voices forever bound to the heart of the mountain, and that if you're not careful, the mountain will claim you too, taking your soul to join the others lost forever in the darkness. Nestled deep in the heart of the old Evernight Woods, a mansion known as Ravenbrook Manor had stood for generations, hidden away from prying eyes and shrouded in rumors of dark, unexplainable events. Once the home of the Calloway family, it had been abandoned for nearly a century after the entire family vanished without a trace one stormy night. The locals believed the family was cursed, bound by a sinister force lurking within the manor's walls. Some said the house itself was alive, feeding on the fears of anyone who dared to enter. But despite these legends, Thomas, a historian obsessed with unraveling the manor's mysteries, decided to explore Ravenbrook Manor himself, determined to uncover the truth behind its dark history. He arrived just as dusk settled over the woods, the last rays of light casting long shadows that seemed to claw at the walls of the mansion. The iron gate creaked as he pushed it open, and he paused, feeling an odd weight in the air, as though something watched from the darkened windows above. Brushing off the feeling his nerves, he made his way up the overgrown path, each step muffled by the thick, damp moss. As he approached the front door, he noticed strange carvings etched into the wood. Symbols he couldn't decipher, their patterns twisting and spiraling in ways that made his eyes ache. He reached out to touch them, but the moment his fingers brushed the carvings, a chill shot up his spine, and he heard a faint whisper just beyond the edge of hearing. Ignoring the sense of foreboding, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air within was thick, stale, carrying the scent of mildew and something else, something sharp and bitter that stung his nose. Dust coated every surface, and the silence was so complete that even his softest footfalls seemed to echo endlessly. The entryway opened into a grand, sweeping staircase that spiraled into darkness above, its wooden railings twisted and warped as if they had been melted and refashioned by some unknown force. Paintings lined the walls, their colors faded, but the eyes of the figures within seemed to gleam with unnatural intensity, following him as he moved. As he ventured further into the house, he began to feel an uncomfortable pressure, as though the walls were slowly closing in. The temperature dropped, and his breath began to fog in front of him. He pulled his flashlight from his bag and turned it on, its beam slicing through the shadows, revealing rooms filled with decaying furniture and shattered glass. Yet, despite the emptiness, he could feel a presence, something lurking just beyond his sight. He brushed it off as his imagination, but the further he went, the stronger the feeling became. He entered a long hallway lined with mirrors, their surfaces clouded with age. As he passed each one, he noticed strange distortions in his reflection, shadows shifting behind him, flickers of movement that disappeared when he turned to look. In one mirror, he thought he saw a figure standing at the end of the hall, cloaked in darkness, watching him with hollow eyes. He turned quickly, his heart pounding, but the hallway was empty. He continued forward, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though the house itself resisted his presence. Finally, he reached the library, a vast room filled with shelves that stretched up to the high, vaulted ceiling. Books of all sizes and ages lined the walls, their spines covered in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate desk, its surface littered with papers, quills, and a single candle that looked freshly melted, as if someone had been there recently. As he approached the desk, he noticed a book lying open, its pages filled with handwritten notes in a language he didn't recognize. The handwriting was shaky, desperate, as though the writer had been in a state of panic. He leaned closer, trying to decipher the symbols, but his vision began to blur, and a wave of dizziness washed over him. Just then, he heard a soft, raspy voice whispering his name, coming from somewhere within the walls. The voice was faint, almost pleading, filled with a sadness that made his skin crawl. He looked around, but the room was empty. Suddenly, the door to the library slammed shut, the sound echoing through the house. He ran to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to set in as he banged against the door, shouting for help, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then he heard footsteps approaching from the other side, slow and deliberate, as though something, or someone, was drawing nearer. His heart raced as he pressed himself against the door, listening to the sound of shuffling feet and the faint whisper of fabric brushing against the floor. The footsteps stopped just outside, and he held his breath, waiting. A soft knock echoed through the room, followed by a low, hollow voice. "You shouldn't have come here, Thomas," it whispered, the sound sliding through the cracks in the door like a thin blade of ice. "This place is ours." He backed away, his flashlight shaking as he swept it around the room, searching for another exit. That was when he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a hidden door, half concealed behind a bookshelf. Desperate, he pushed the shelf aside, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Without a second thought, he ran down the stairs, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls as he plunged deeper into the bowels of the mansion. The air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to press in around him, thick and suffocating. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a long, narrow corridor lined with cell doors. The smell was overwhelming, decay, damp earth, and something metallic, like old blood. He shone his flashlight down the corridor, and his stomach twisted as he saw what lay inside the cells. Figures barely human, their eyes hollow and their mouths open in silent screams, chained to the walls as though left there to rot. Some of them looked as though they had been there for centuries, their flesh mummified and stretched tight over brittle bones. He staggered back, a wave of nausea washing over him, but before he could turn to run, he heard the footsteps again, this time coming from both ends of the corridor, closing in on him. Panic seized him as he turned to run, but he found himself facing a solid wall. The corridor had shifted, trapping him. As he pounded against the wall, desperate for an escape, the whispers grew louder, surrounding him, filling his mind with a cacophony of voices, all chanting the same thing: "Stay with us, stay forever." Suddenly, he felt an icy hand grip his shoulder, its fingers like iron as they dug into his flesh. He spun around, his flashlight slipping from his grasp as he came face to face with a figure cloaked in shadows, its eyes gleaming with a cold, predatory light. The figure leaned in, its mouth stretching into an unnatural smile, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. "We've been waiting for you, Thomas," it hissed, its voice a blend of countless others, each one filled with malice and hunger. "You're finally home." As he felt the figure's cold breath wash over him, the walls seemed to close in, and the last thing he saw was the twisted grin of the creature as it dragged him down into the darkness. Days later, a search party arrived at Ravenbrook Manor, but there was no sign of Thomas. only his flashlight, lying abandoned in the entryway, its battery drained. They say that if you listen closely on a quiet night near the manor, you can still hear his voice among the whispers, begging for release, forever trapped within the shadows of Ravenbrook Manor. At the edge of an old, quiet town, hidden among ancient trees and choked by wild ivy, lay the ruins of an estate called Hollow's End. For decades, it had been abandoned, its windows shattered, its walls scarred by time and neglect. No one dared go near it, not since the whispers had begun, the rumors of a family's tragedy that had cursed the place for all who entered. The few who wandered close claimed to hear faint cries echoing through the night, and shadows shifting in the corners of their eyes. But to Jacob, a writer in desperate need of inspiration, Hollow's End was the perfect subject for his next book. He arrived in the dead of winter, his car packed with supplies, ready to spend a week in the old manor. The sun had barely set as he reached the estate, casting the land in a deep, creeping twilight. The air was thick, biting with a chill that seemed to seep into his bones. The closer he got, the more he felt a strange weight settle on him, as if invisible eyes were watching, waiting. He hesitated, but curiosity pulled him forward, his footsteps crunching over the snow as he approached the large, weathered doors. Pushing them open, he stepped into a grand foyer that had once been magnificent. Now it was cloaked in dust and shadows, the remnants of luxury lost to time. His breath fogged in the freezing air, and his footsteps echoed in the eerie silence. As he explored, he noticed peculiar details. Portraits on the walls with faded eyes that seemed to follow him, cold drafts that came and went as if in rhythm with his movements. In one of the sitting rooms, he found a tarnished silver locket on a small, ornate table. Curiosity overtook him, and he opened it, revealing a photograph of a woman and a child, their faces solemn and strangely familiar, even though he was certain he'd never seen them before. He pocketed the locket, thinking it might add an interesting detail for his story. But the moment he did, he felt a chill unlike any other, as though a shadow had passed over his heart. That night, as he tried to sleep in one of the upstairs rooms, he found it impossible to ignore the faint noises echoing through the halls. Whispers just beyond his hearing, footsteps that stopped as soon as he strained to listen. He lay there in the dark, his mind racing with questions, yet every time he closed his eyes, he felt as though someone stood at the foot of his bed, watching him. When he finally managed to drift into a restless sleep, he dreamed of the woman and child from the locket. In the dream, they stood in the grand foyer, their faces twisted in fear as they tried to reach out to him, but he felt a cold, invisible barrier keeping him from moving toward them. The next morning, he woke to find frost coating the windows, the room frigid despite the fire he had tried to light. As he ventured downstairs, he found that the rooms had somehow shifted in the night. The once grand library, where he'd left his notebooks, was now a small, narrow corridor, its walls lined with mirrors. In each mirror, his reflection seemed slightly off. His eyes appeared darker, hollow, his face gaunt and worn. He backed away, unsettled, but as he turned, he heard a faint laugh echo down the corridor, high and childlike, laced with a mocking edge. Disturbed, he tried to leave the house for some fresh air, but when he reached the front door, he found it locked, the old brass key on the inside twisting on its own, as though manipulated by invisible hands. He pulled and shouted, but the door refused to budge. The windows were similarly resistant, as though the house itself had decided to hold him prisoner. Panic rose within him, but he forced himself to remain calm. He tried to return to the room he had slept in, but the staircase twisted as he climbed it, leading him to a hallway he hadn't seen before. As he wandered through the unfamiliar rooms, he saw glimpses of shadows flitting across the walls, and once, he thought he saw the child from his dream, standing at the end of a corridor, watching him with large, sorrowful eyes. He called out, but she disappeared, melting into the shadows. Every attempt to navigate back to familiar ground only brought him deeper into the maze of rooms and corridors that seemed to shift and stretch with each step he took. Days passed, though he lost track of time. Every night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with fragments of a story he couldn't quite piece together. He began to see visions, images of the woman in the locket, wandering the halls in a tattered dress, her eyes filled with a haunting sorrow, her lips moving as though trying to speak, though no sound came. Once, he awoke in the middle of the night to find her standing by his bed, her hand reaching out to him, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes pleading. But when he tried to touch her, she vanished, leaving him with an intense, aching loneliness that felt like it would consume him. One night, as he sat in the library, poring over old journals he had found hidden behind a loose floorboard, he discovered the truth. The woman in the locket was named Eleanor Calloway, the last living member of the family who had once owned Hollow's End. She had a daughter, Lillian, who had fallen ill, and despite every effort to save her, the child had died in the dead of winter. Devastated, Eleanor had been consumed by grief, convinced that her daughter's spirit was still in the house. Her journals spoke of rituals, desperate attempts to call Lillian's soul back from the beyond, and of a growing darkness within the walls, a presence that seemed to feed on her despair. The final entry was chilling, written in jagged, desperate handwriting. The house has taken her, and now it wants me. There is no escape, it demands a soul. As he read those last words, the room grew unbearably cold, and he felt a presence behind him, breathing down his neck, its breath frigid as death. Slowly, he turned to find Eleanor herself standing there, her face twisted in agony, her hands reaching for him. Her mouth opened, and a hollow, echoing voice filled the room. "The house needs a soul, Jacob. Give it yours, and let me rest." He bolted from the library, stumbling through the darkened halls, his heart pounding as the house seemed to come alive around him. Doors slammed shut, trapping him, and shadows crawled along the walls, reaching out to him with grasping, skeletal fingers. The whispers were deafening now, voices pleading, weeping, demanding his soul. He felt his strength fading, as though the very air he breathed was poisoned, sapping his life away with each step. Desperate, he tried to reach the front door, but the hallways twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the heart of the house. Finally, he collapsed in a small, dark room he didn't recognize. The walls were lined with old family portraits, their faces watching him with expressions of pity and sorrow. In the center of the room stood a single, dusty chair. Exhausted, defeated, he slumped into the chair, feeling the cold seep into his bones, and as he sat there, he felt his life draining away, leaving him hollow, empty. The last thing he saw was Eleanor's face, her eyes filled with a strange, sorrowful gratitude as her spirit faded into the shadows, finally released. When the townsfolk found the house weeks later, they found Jacob's belongings, but there was no sign of him, only a thin layer of frost covering everything, as if the house itself had been frozen in time. Some say if you listen closely near Hollow's End, you can still hear his voice among the whispers, calling out for release, forever bound to the house that had claimed his soul. There was a small, forgotten village at the edge of the woods, where the houses were worn and crooked, as if the village itself were slowly sinking into the earth. The villagers spoke in hushed tones about the strange happenings in the nearby forest. Whispers of figures seen moving between the trees, faces that appeared in the reflection of ponds, and the faint sounds of crying carried by the wind. Among the village's many dark stories, the most chilling was the tale of the Black Hollow, an abandoned church deep within the woods that no one had dared approach for centuries. Lena had always been drawn to the eerie, the unexplained, the places others feared to tread. She'd grown up hearing the terrifying stories about Black Hollow, about how those who entered never came back. Curiosity ate away at her until one cold autumn morning, she decided she would venture into the woods and see the cursed church for herself. The villagers warned her, pleading for her to stay away, but their fear only deepened her resolve. She packed a bag with food, a flashlight, and a map, then set off into the dense forest, determined to uncover whatever truth lay behind the terrifying legend. The forest was silent as Lena made her way deeper, the trees growing thicker around her, their twisted branches like bony hands reaching for the sky. The air grew damp and heavy, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. Every step she took seemed to be swallowed by the soft, moss-covered ground, and she soon lost track of time as the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before her. The path had grown faint, the markers barely visible, but she pressed on, ignoring the creeping sensation that she was being watched. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, she finally saw it. The church, standing in the clearing like a rotting monument to some forgotten age. The building was tall, its roof caved in, and the stone walls crumbled with age. Black vines crawled up the sides, and the windows were shattered, their jagged edges glinting like broken teeth. The door was ajar, the dark interior beckoning her forward. Lena stood at the threshold for a moment, her heart racing, but the allure of the mystery was too strong. She stepped inside. The church was cold, the air thick with the scent of decay and dust. The altar at the front was covered in grime, and scattered across the floor were remnants of candles, their wax long melted away. The silence inside was suffocating, almost as if the building itself was holding a secret, something ancient and malevolent. As Lena moved further into the church, she noticed strange markings carved into the stone, symbols she didn't recognize, but their meaning was unmistakable. They seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat just beneath the surface. Suddenly she heard it, a soft, whispering sound, like a chant in an unknown language, barely audible but growing louder. She froze, listening intently. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the altar. Her pulse quickened as she approached, her flashlight flickering in the oppressive dark. The closer she got, the louder the whispers became, until they filled her mind, a chorus of voices, desperate and pleading. The words were unintelligible, but the feeling they evoked was unmistakable, a sense of dread so deep it made her stomach churn. When she reached the altar, she found something she hadn't expected, an old, weathered book lying open on the stone surface. The pages were yellowed with age, and the ink was faint, but there was something familiar about the symbols inscribed within it. As she flipped through the pages, one word stood out among the rest: sacrifice. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the whispers seemed to crescendo, their voices growing frantic. She turned the page, revealing a diagram of the church's floor plan, with markings indicating certain locations. Beneath the diagram was a passage, written in an archaic script that made her skin crawl. As she read it aloud, the room seemed to tremble, and the ground beneath her feet began to shake. Suddenly, the church doors slammed shut with a deafening crash. Lena spun around, her flashlight darting across the room, but there was nothing except the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally, curling and twisting as though alive. The whispers intensified, now forming coherent phrases, chanting her name in a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices layered over each other, desperate and pleading. She tried to reach the door, but it was as if an invisible force was holding it shut. She pounded on the wood, but her hands passed right through it, like it was made of smoke. Panicking, she turned back to the altar, but the room had changed. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows gathering in the corners, and in the distance, a low growl rumbled, as if something were waking from a long slumber. That's when she saw it, figures emerging from the dark corners of the church. At first, they were barely more than shadows, but as they drew closer, their shapes solidified. Pale, gaunt faces, their eyes wide with fear, their mouths stretched into unnatural grins. The figures were the souls of those who had entered the church before her, each one forever trapped, their eyes hollow with madness. They reached out for her, their bony hands grasping for her flesh, but just as they were about to touch her, they stopped. A figure emerged from the shadows behind them, a tall, cloaked figure whose face was hidden beneath a hood. It moved with an unsettling fluidity, its every step reverberating in the air. The whispers fell silent, and the figure spoke, its voice low and guttural. "You should not have come here," it said, its words seeping into Lena's mind like a poison. "The church demands its due, and now you are the offering." Lena tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She struggled against an invisible force, her body paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of fear. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating, and she felt an icy hand brush against her cheek. The world around her spun, the shadows closing in tighter, until the only thing she could see was the figure's face, pale and twisted, with eyes that burned with an ancient hunger. Before she could scream, everything went black. Days later, the villagers found the church, still standing in the woods, untouched by time. But there was no sign of Lena. The only trace of her presence was a small, tattered book lying on the altar, its pages fluttering in the wind. Some say she became one of the shadows, trapped within the church, her soul forever bound to its dark history. Others say she became the church's latest offering, her name added to the whispers that now call to anyone who dares to enter Black Hollow. And when the wind blows through the trees, the villagers say they can hear her voice, faint and pleading, calling out from the darkness of the woods, begging to be released. But no one has ever answered her call. Welcome back to my channel, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. The rhythmic thud of my footsteps echoed through the empty parking lot as I made my way to my car. The frigid night air nipped at my exposed skin, urging me to hurry. I fumbled with my keys, my fingers numb from the cold, when I heard it, the sickening screech of metal giving. Way my heart lurched as I watched my trusty sedan sag to one side, the tire deflating with a hiss. No, 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 I muttered, kneeling to inspect the damage. A jagged piece of metal glinted in the dim light, firmly embedded in my tire. I let out a frustrated GR, my breath forming misty clouds in the air. Of all the nights for this to happen, it had to be when I was already running late for my sister's engagement party. I pulled out my phone, ready to call for help, only to be greeted by a black screen dead of course it was I hadn't Charged it during my double shift at the diner, too busy juggling orders and dodging handsy customers to remember. As I contemplated my options, headlights swept across Ross. The lot, a sleek black car pulled up beside me, its engine purring smoothly. The window rolled down, revealing a man with a kind face and salt and pepper hair. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice warm and concerned. I nodded, gesturing to my saddle, looking tire flat, and my phone's dead, so I can't even call for help. He smiled sympathetically. "That's rough. Look, I'm heading into town. I'd be happy to give you a lift if you need one." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to decline, to wait for someone else, anyone else. But the lot was deserted, and I was already an hour late. My sister would never forgive me if I missed her big moment. "Are you sure?" I asked, biting my lip. "I don't want to inconvenience you." "Not at all," he assured me. "I'm John, by the way. And really, it's no trouble." Something in his easy manner put me at ease. Against my better judgment, I found myself smiling back. "I'm Sarah, and honestly, that would be amazing. Thank you so much." I grabbed my purse from my car, locked it, and slid into the passenger seat of John's vehicle. The interior was immaculate, smelling faintly of leather and pine. As we pulled out of the lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake. "So Sarah," John said conversationally, as we merged onto the highway, "what is you out so late on a Tuesday night?" "My sister's engagement party," I explained, fidgeting with the strap of my purse. "I'm already super late because of work, and now this. She's going to kill me." Jan chuckled. "I'm sure she'll understand. Family usually does." As we chatted, I found myself relaxing. John was easy to talk to, asking about my job at the diner and sharing stories about his own sister. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized we should have reached town by now. "I'm John?" the first asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I think we might have missed the exit." He glanced at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Oh, don't worry, I know a shortcut." A chill ran down my spine. That had nothing to do with the car's air conditioning. I tried to subtly check the door, my fingers searching for the handle. There was nothing there, just smooth, featureless metal. Where the handle should have been, panic flared in my chest, threatening to choke me. I forced myself to take a deep breath, to stay calm. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was just a different model of car, one I wasn't familiar with. "Actually," I said, striving for a casual tone, "I think I'd prefer to stick to the main road. My sister's already worried, and I don't want to make her wait any longer." John's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. "Now, Sarah," he said, his voice losing its warmth, "I thought we were getting along so well. Don't ruin it by being difficult." My heart pounded so hard I was sure he could hear it. I searched desperately for a way out, but we were on a dark, deserted stretch of highway. No other cars in sight, no buildings, nowhere to run. "Please," I whispered, hating how small and scared my voice sounded. "Just let me out. I won't tell anyone, I swear." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, Sarah, sweet, naive Sarah, do you really think you're the first to make that promise, to beg and plead?" Tears stung my eyes as the full horror of my situation sank in. This wasn't some random act of kindness gone wrong. This was planned, calculated, and I had walked right into his trap. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. John's face twisted into a cruel smile. "Because he said simply, "because there will always be trusting little lambs like you, so eager to see the good in people, so willfully blind to the wolves in their midst." I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. Panic wouldn't help me now. I needed to think, to find a way out of this nightmare. "My sister," I said, grasping at straws. "She's expecting me. She'll call the police when I don't show up." Jan shrugged, unfazed. "And tell them what? That her irresponsible little sister, known for being chronically late, didn't show up to a party? That's hardly cause for alarm." Now is it? He was right, and we both knew it. My tardiness was a running joke in my family. They'd be annoyed, maybe worried, but not enough to involve the authorities. Not for. The more I dug, the more unsettling the story became. Elizabeth wasn't the only one to vanish mysteriously over the decades. There had been others, always young women, always alone in the house. And then on my fifth night in the house, it happened. I woke to the sound of footsteps, louder and more deliberate than before. They were coming up the stairs, heading straight for my room. I lay frozen in terror, watching as the doorknob slowly began to turn. The chair I had wedged against it shuddered, then toppled with a crash. And there, silhouetted in the doorway, stood a figure that could not possibly be real. He was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long and joints that bent at odd angles. His face was a featureless expanse of pale skin, save for two hollow black eyes and a red slash of a mouth stitched into a permanent, leering grin. I screamed until my throat was raw, until I tasted blood. But no sound came out. The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I lunged for the window, my fingers scrabbling at the latch just as I felt cold straw-like fingers brush against my neck. The window Burst open, I threw myself out, landing hard on the overgrown lawn below. I ran barefoot in my pajamas. I ran until my lungs burned, and my legs gave out. When I finally stopped, I found myself in the center of town, miles from the house. A concerned police officer approached me asking if I was all right. I babbled my story, fully aware of how insane it sounded. To their credit, the police took me seriously enough to investigate. They found nothing, of course, no evidence of an intruder, no hidden rooms or secret passages. Even the dress and diary I discovered in the attic were gone, as if they'd never existed. My aunt returned early from her trip, concerned about my breakdown. She sold the house, soon after, unable to look at it without remembering my wild tales of ghosts and disappearances. Years have passed, and I've tried to convince myself that it was all a vivid nightmare, a product of an overactive imagination and too many late-night horror movies. But sometimes in the dead of night I still hear it, the soft thump of footsteps inside the walls, the whisper of straw-like fingers reaching for me in the dark, and I know with a certainty that chills me to my core that somewhere out there in that old Victorian house, he's still waiting, the man with the stitched red smile, while waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to cross his threshold. The moment I saw Eliza's eyes light up as she talked about her parents, I should have known something was off. We'd been dating for 6 months, and this was the first time she'd mentioned them with anything other than a dismissive wave of her hand. But love, as they say, is blind, and I was about to walk straight into the darkness. They're going to adore you, Jack, Eliza gushed, her fingers intertwining with mine. As we sped down the highway, the countryside blurred past, an endless sea of green, giving way to more remote, rugged terrain. Mom's been pestering me for weeks to bring you home. I smiled, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety in my stomach. Meeting the parents was always nerve-wracking, but something about this felt different. Maybe it was the way Eliza's grip on the steering wheel tightened every time I asked about her childhood, or the fact that we were driving 3 hours into the middle of nowhere for a simple dinner. As we turned onto a narrow dirt road, the trees seemed to close in around us, branches scraping against the car like grasping fingers. The shadows lengthened despite it being mid-afternoon. Almost there, Eliza chirped, an edge of excitement in her voice that I'd never heard before. The road opened up to reveal a sprawling farmhouse, its white paint peeling to reveal weathered wood beneath. A group of people stood on the porch, their faces breaking into wide smiles. As we pulled up, welcome home, sweetheart. A woman who could only be Eliza's mother enveloped her in a crushing hug. Her eyes, when they turned to me, were sharp and assessing. And you must be Jack, we've heard so much about you. I shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, all the while feeling like a specimen under a microscope. There was something off about their smiles, too wide, too fixed. And why were there so many of them? Eliza had only ever mentioned her parents, but here were at least a dozen people, all claiming to be aunts, uncles, cousins. As we were ushered inside, I caught snippets of conversation that made little sense. Is everything prepared for tonight? The circle is ready, we just need. They fell silent as I passed, those unnerving smiles snapping back into place. Dinner was a lavish affair, the table groaning under the weight of dishes I'd never seen before. Strange herbs and spices tickled my nose, making my head swim. Or was that the wine? I couldn't remember drinking much, but my glass seemed to refill itself when I wasn't looking. So Jack, Eliza's father, leaned in, his eyes glittering into the candlelight. What are your intentions with our Eliza? The question was normal enough, but there was a weight to it that made me pause. The room had gone silent, all eyes fixed on me. From everywhere and nowhere at once I sat up, heart racing, straining my ears in the darkness. There it was again, thump, 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 like footsteps, but muffled as if coming from inside the walls themselves. I reached for my phone, its screen casting a ghostly glow across the room. 3:17 a.m., far too early for any reasonable explanation. Hello, I called out, my voice trembling. Is someone there? Silence answered me, heavy and oppressive. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was all in my imagination, I heard it again, clearer this time, deliberate, coming from directly above me. With shaking hands, I turned on the bedside lamp and got to my feet. The rational part of my brain argued that it was probably just an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a squirrel that had found its way into the attic, but a deeper, more primal part of me knew that wasn't the case. I crept out into the hallway, every shadow seeming to loom and shift in the dim light. The thumping had stopped, but now I could hear something else, a faint, barely audible whisper, like someone muttering to themselves. Just on the edge of hearing, at the end of the hall, stood a door I hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, revealing a narrow staircase leading up into darkness, the attic. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, the door slowly began to open wider, as if pushed by an unseen hand. I ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me and wedging a chair under the handle. I spent the rest of the night huddled under the covers, jumping at every creak and groan of the house, convinced that at any moment something would come bursting through the door. When morning finally came, I felt foolish. In the harsh light of day, my fears seemed childish and Overblown, I decided to investigate the attic, determined to prove to myself that there was a perfectly rational explanation for the night's events. The attic door stood closed, showing no signs of the eerie movement I'd witnessed. I took a deep breath and pushed it open, wincing at the loud creak of rusty hinges. The stairs beyond were thick with dust, undisturbed save for a few small animal tracks. See, I told myself, just a critter after all. But as I climbed the stairs, that certainty began to waver. The attic was a cluttered maze of forgotten treasure and discarded junk, illuminated by weak sunlight streaming through a grimy window. And there in the far corner stood something that made my blood run cold, a rocking chair, old and weathered, its wood darkened with age, and perched upon it, staring at me with glassy eyes, was a doll, not one of the antique porcelain dolls from downstairs, but something far more unsettling. It was crudely made, fashioned from what looked like burlap and straw, with buttons for eyes and a stitched red smile that seemed to leer at me. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drew closer, I noticed something clutched in its crude straw hands, a book, its leather cover cracked and peeling with age. With trembling fingers, I pried the book from the doll's grasp. It fell open, revealing yellowed pages covered in spidery handwriting, a diary I realized dated 1897. I began to read, my eyes widening with each passage. The diary belonged to a young woman named Elizabeth, the daughter of the house's original owners. Her entries started innocently enough, chronicling the mundane details of her daily life. But as I flipped through the pages, a darker narrative emerged. Elizabeth wrote of strange noises in the night, of whispers and footsteps when the house should have been empty. She spoke of a presence that watched her, that followed her from room to room. And then, most chillingly, she began to write of a figure she saw in her dreams, a man with hollow eyes and a stitched red smile. The final entry dated just days before Elizabeth's mysterious disappearance, according to a yellowed newspaper clipping tucked into the back of the book, read simply, "He's here, God help me, he's real. And he's here." I dropped the book, my hands shaking uncontrollably. This had to be some kind of sick joke, a story concocted by my aunt or the previous owners to scare gullible house sitters. But as I turned to leave, my foot caught on something hidden beneath years of dust and cobwebs. A floorboard shifted, revealing a small space beneath, and there, nestled in the darkness, was a bundle of cloth. My heart in my throat, I reached down and pulled it out. It was a dress, faded and yellowed with age, but unmistakably a woman's dress from the late 1800s, and on it dark stains that could only be blood. I ran out of the attic, down the stairs, not stopping until I was out of the house and gasping for air on the front lawn. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd found. Was it possible? Could Elizabeth's story be true? The next few days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. I jumped at every sound, convinced that at any moment I would turn around and see the figure from Elizabeth's diary, the man with the stitched red smile. I thought about leaving, about calling my aunt and making up some excuse, but something kept me there, a morbid curiosity perhaps, or a stubborn determination to uncover the truth. I spent hours researching the house's history, poring over old newspapers and public records. Stammered, my tongue feeling thick in my mouth. "I love her, sir. I want to build a life with her." A ripple of something passed through the room, approval, relief I couldn't quite place it. "Excellent," he beamed, raising his glass to Jack, and Eliza. The toast was echoed around the table, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just passed some sort of test. And I wasn't sure. I wanted to know what would have happened if I'd failed. As the night wore on, my unease grew. The conversation flowed around me, peppered with words and phrases I didn't understand, references to the old ways and the coming alignment. Whenever I tried to ask Eliza about it, she'd squeeze my hand and change the subject. Finally, as the moon rose high in the sky, Eliza's mother stood. "It's time," she announced, her voice ringing with an authority that silenced the room. Eliza beamed at me, taking my hand. "Come on, Jack, there's something I want to show you." We filed out of the house, the entire family moving with a purpose that sent chills down my spine. They led us to a clearing in the woods behind the house, where a bonfire roared to life with unnatural speed, and there, carved into the earth, was a circle, intricate symbols I'd never seen before, lined its edges seeming to pulse with an inner light. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Eliza turned to me, her eyes shining with a fervor that terrified me. "This is who we are, Jack, who you're going to be." It hit me then with a clarity that cut through the fog in my brain. The isolation, the strange conversations, the way they'd all been watching me, assessing me. This wasn't a family. It was a cult. I tried to back away, but strong hands gripped my arms. Eliza's uncles, their friendly smiles now twisted into something cruel. "Don't fight it, Jack," Eliza said, stroking my cheek. "This is the gift. You're being chosen for what." I managed to choke out as they dragged me towards the circle. Her father stepped forward, a curved knife glinting in his hand. "To join us, of course, to become one with the old ones, to transcend your mortal flesh and embrace eternity." I struggled, panic lending me strength. but it was useless. There were too many of them, and whatever they'd slipped into my food and drink had left. Me weak and disoriented, they forced me to my knees at the edge of the circle. Eliza knelt beside me, taking my face in her hands. "I'm sorry, it has to be this way," she said, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the woman. I thought I knew, but you'll understand soon. We need new blood, Jack, pure blood. And you're perfect. Her father began to chant the words guttural, and inhuman the symbols around the circle flared to life, pulsing with sickly green light. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if something vast and ancient was pressing down upon us. I closed my eyes, bracing for the bite of the knife, but instead I felt nothing. The chanting faltered, confusion rippling through the group. I dared to open my eyes. The symbol were fading, the unnatural light guttering like a candle in the wind. "What's happening?" Eliza's mother demanded. "Why isn't it working?" Her father's face was a mask of rage and disbelief. "The blood," he snarled, rounding on me. "It's not pure, he's tainted." Eliza recoiled from me, as if I'd burned her. "What does that mean, Jack? What aren't you telling us?" In that moment, hysterical laughter bubbled up inside me. Of all the things that could have saved me, it was this. "I'm on blood thinners," I gasped out between fits of laughter. "Have been since I was a teenager. Guess your old ones don't like their sacrifices premedicated." How the look of utter bewilderment on their faces was almost comical here. They were this ancient cult with their eldritch rituals thwarted by modern medicine. In the confusion that followed, I managed to break free. I ran, crashing through the underbrush branches. Whipping at my face behind me, I could hear shouts of anger and frustration, but they faded as I put distance between us. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, my lungs burning and my legs trembling. A passing trucker took pity on me, giving me a ride to the nearest town, where I immediately went to the police. They didn't believe me, of course. By the time they went to investigate, the farmhouse was deserted, no trace of the cult or Eliza or the nightmare I'd endured sometimes late at night. I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear chanting on the wind. I've moved cities, changed my name, done everything I can to disappear. But I know they're out there waiting, watching. And I know that someday they'll find another lonely soul to lure into their web, someone whose blood is pure enough for their twisted rituals. I can only hope that when that day comes, fate will intervene again, that something as simple as a daily aspirin might be enough to save a life and thwart the plans of beings older than time itself, because in this world of ancient horrors and eldritch abominations, sometimes our greatest protection is the very thing that makes us human: our fragility, our imperfection, our wonderfully, blessedly impure blood. The pulsing bass from the party still echoed in my ears as I stumbled out into the cool night air. I knew I'd had too much to drink, but the thrill of sneaking out and the euphoria of finally fitting in with the popular crowd had clouded my judgment. Now, as I stood on the sidewalk, the world spinning slightly, reality began to set in. I was miles from home, way past curfew, and in no state to make it back on my own. That's when I saw him leaning against a sleek black car, a cigarette bending. From his lips he looked older, maybe early 20s, with a jawline that could cut glass and eyes that seemed to see right through me. I'd noticed him inside, watching me from across the room, but I'd been too caught up in the excitement to pay much attention. "Need a ride, sweetheart?" he called out, his voice smooth as honey. Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to call a cab or a friend, anything but accept a ride from a stranger. But the alcohol in my system muffled those warnings, replacing them with a false sense of security. "That would be amazing," I heard myself say the words, slurring slightly. "I'm Jess," he smiled, stubbing out his cigarette under his boot. "Matt, hop in." As I slid into the passenger seat, the leather cool against my bare legs, I felt a twinge of unease, but I pushed it aside, focusing instead on giving Matt directions to my house. We pulled away from the curb, the streets of my hometown blurring past the window. At first the ride was silent, save for the low hum of the radio. Then Matt spoke, his voice casual, but with an undercurrent I couldn't quite place. "So Jess, you go to parties like that often?" I shook my head a little too vigorously. "No, first time, actually. I'm usually more of a stay-at-home type." He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "A good girl." Then, trying something new, the way he said "good girl" made me squirm in my seat. I tried to change the subject, asking about the music playing softly in the background, but Matt seemed more interested in me, peppering me with questions about my life, my friends, my family. It wasn't until we'd been driving for about 20 minutes that I realized something was wrong. The houses were becoming less frequent, replaced by dark stretches of forest and fields. "This wasn't the way to my house." "Matt," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice, "I think we might have missed a turn. My street is back that way." He didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier warmth. "We're not going to your house, Jess." Ice flooded my veins, sobering me up faster than a bucket of cold water. "What do you mean, where are we going?" Matt's grip on the steering Will tightened his knuckles, turning white. Somewhere private, somewhere we can get to know each other better. Panic clawed at my throat. I reached for the door handle, only to find it locked. Matt laughed, a harsh grating sound that bore no resemblance to his earlier charm. Did you really think I was just being nice? He sneered. A pretty little thing like you, all alone and drunk. You're lucky I found you first. There are much worse people out there, you know. Tears stung my eyes as the full horror of my situation sank in. I was trapped in a car with a predator speeding towards God knows where, with no way to call for help. My phone was in my purse, tossed carelessly into the back seat. When I'd first gotten in, please, I begged, hating how small and scared my voice sounded. Just let me out, I won't tell anyone, I swear. Matt's response was to accelerate, the speedometer creeping past 80, then 90. The world outside became a dark blur, trees and fields melting together in a dizzying rush. My mind raced, searching desperately for a way out. Could I grab the wheel? But at this speed we'd both likely die in the crash, break a window. Even if I managed it, where would I go? We were miles from anywhere, and Matt would surely catch me before I could find help. As we sped through the night, I thought of my parents, probably still sleeping peacefully, unaware that their daughter was living a nightmare. I thought of my friends, the ones I'd been so eager to impress at the party. Would they even remember seeing me leave? Matt's voice cut through my panicked thoughts. You know, this is usually the part where they start crying, begging, promising me anything if I'll just let them go. He glanced at me, raising an eyebrow. You're being awfully quiet, Jess. No last-ditch efforts? I met his gaze, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. Would it make a difference? He considered this for a moment, but then shook his head. No, I suppose not, but it's always interesting to see what people are willing to do when they're desperate. As we lapsed into silence, I found my thoughts drifting to all the warnings I'd ignored, my mother's constant reminders to never accept rides from strangers, the assemblies at school about staying safe, even my own instincts, which I'd pushed aside in favor of feeling grown-up and adventurous. The car slowed, turning onto a bumpy dirt road. Through the trees I could make out the dim outline of a structure. A cabin, old and decrepit, loomed before us. My prison, I realized with a sinking feeling as we rolled to a stop. Matt turned to me, his eyes glinting in the darkness. Home sweet homes, Jess, he said, his voice dripping with false warmth. I do hope you'll be comfortable here. You'll be staying for quite some time. In that moment, something inside me snapped. The fear that had paralyzed me gave way to a surge of adrenaline and determination. I wasn't going to be another statistic, another cautionary tale. I was going to fight. As Matt reached across to grab me, I struck my elbow, connected with his nose. With a satisfying crunch, he reeled back, howling in pain and surprise. In that moment of confusion, I lunged for my purse in the back seat, my fingers closing around my phone. Matt recovered quickly, grabbing a fistful of my hair and yanking me back. But it was too late. I'd already hit the emergency call button, the phone connecting to 911. Even as it clattered to the floor, you little, Matt snarled, his hand closing around my throat. I clawed at his face, kicking and thrashing with every ounce of strength I had through the roaring in my ears. I could hear a tiny voice from the phone. 911, what's your emergency? Matt's eyes widened as he realized what I'd done. He released me, scrambling to find the phone. But in his panic, he'd forgotten about the car doors. With shaking hands, I managed to unlock my door and throw myself out onto the dirt road. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me, but adrenaline and fear propelled me forward. I scrambled to my feet and ran. My bare feet slipped on loose gravel as I plunged into the dark woods surrounding the cabin. Behind me, I could hear Matt's enraged shouts and the sound of him stumbling after me. But I had a head start, and the dense undergrowth slowed him down. I ran until my lungs burned, until each breath was agony, until I couldn't hear anything but the pounding of my own heart. Finally, I allowed myself to slow collapsing. Against a tree in the distance, I could see lights. A house or maybe a gas station. Civilization, safety. With renewed determination, I pushed myself onward as I staggered onto the lit parking lot of a 24-hour truck stop. I must have looked AF, fright dress torn, covered in dirt and scratches. Wild with terror, the night clerk took one look at me and reached for the phone. It's okay, I gasped, my voice raw. The police are already on their way. In the days that followed, as I sat through police interviews and hospital examinations, the reality of how close I'd come to disappearing forever sank in. They caught Matt trying to flee the state, his car still parked at that lonely cabin in the woods. The evidence they found there suggested I wasn't his first victim, but I was determined to be his last. Sometimes in my darkest moments, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found the strength to fight back, if I'd given in to despair and resignation. But mostly I'm grateful to be alive, to have a second chance now when I see young girls at parties. I want to shake them, to make them understand the dangers that lurk in seemingly innocent offers. But I know that's not the answer. Instead, I share my story. I speak at schools, write articles, do whatever I can to spread awareness, because the sad truth is there will always be predators like Matt out there, But if I can help even one person avoid the nightmare I lived through, then maybe some good can come from that terrible night. And maybe, just maybe, I can finally put the ghosts of what might have been to rest. The first time I saw him, I thought it was just a coincidence at all. Man with a shock of red hair standing by the frozen foods in the grocery store. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the open freezer beside me. I shrugged it off, grabbed my ice cream, and went about my day. But then I saw him again and again. And again. It started small. At first I'd catch glimpses of him across the street. As I walked to work, he'd be there in the background of a crowded coffee shop, his eyes always finding mine no matter how hard I tried to avoid his gaze. At the gym, I'd see him reflected in the mirrors, always a few machines behind me, never approaching, but never quite far enough away to ease the knot of anxiety in my stomach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe we just had similar schedules, maybe he lived in my neighborhood. But as the days turned into weeks, the sightings became more frequent, more deliberate. He was no longer content to lurk in the background. Now he'd stand directly across the street from my apartment building, staring up at my window for hours. I'd see him outside my office while I'm pretending to read a newspaper, but his eyes never leaving the front door. The worst part was nobody else seemed to notice him. When I pointed him out to friends or coworkers, they'd squint in the direction I was indicating, then shrug and say they didn't see anyone matching my description. Was I going crazy? Had the stress of my new job finally gotten to me? But I knew what I was seeing. The man was real, and he was everywhere. One night, after a particularly stressful day of feeling his eyes on me everywhere, when I decided I'd had enough, I marched across the street to where he stood, his tall frame illuminated by a streetlight. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my attempts to sound brave. "Why are you following me?" He smiled, a slow, unsettling curve of his lips that made my skin crawl. "You know who I am, Sarah," he said, his voice low and oddly familiar. "You've always known." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. How did he know my name, and why did his voice sound like it was coming from inside my own head? Before I could respond, a car horn blared, startling me. I turned towards the sound, and when I looked back, the man was gone, vanished, as if he'd never been there at all that night. I barely slept. Every creak of my apartment, every shadow on the wall seemed to take on a sinister quality. I kept expecting to see his face peering in through my window. Even though I was on the 5th floor the next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face the thought of going outside, of seeing him again. Instead, I spent the day researching stalking cases, looking for anything that might help me understand what was happening. As I scrolled through forums and articles, a chill ran down my spine. So many of these stories sounded like mine. Women who saw the same man everywhere they went, who felt constantly watched, constantly afraid. And in almost every case, the police couldn't help. There was never enough evidence, never any proof that the stalker was real. I was about to close my laptop in frustration when a message popped up, an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "I can help against my better judgment." I opened it. The message was brief. "I know what you're going through. I've been there. If you want answers, meet me at the old clock tower downtown tonight, 8 p.m. Come alone." My finger hovered over the delete button. This had to be a trap, right? For all I knew, it could be the red-haired man himself luring me out. But then again, what if it wasn't? What if this person really did have answers? After weeks of feeling like I was losing my mind, the prospect of understanding what was happening to me was too tempting to resist. At 7:55 p.m., I found myself standing at the base of the clock tower, my heart racing. The area was deserted, the old building looming over me like a silent sentinel. I was about to turn and leave, convinced I'd made a terrible mistake, when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, half expecting to see the red-haired man. Instead, I was face to face with a woman about my age. She had dark circles under her eyes and a haunted look that I recognized all too well. "Sarah," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, too nervous to speak. She let out a long breath. "I'm Emily. I'm the one who emailed you. I've been where you are. The man you've been seeing, he's been following me too for years." My knees went weak with relief. Finally, someone who believed me, someone who understood. Emily led me to a nearby bench, and for the next hour she told me her story, how the red-haired man had appeared in her life 5 years ago, how he'd slowly taken over every aspect of her existence, how she'd lost jobs, relationships, even her family, because no one believed her. "But here's the thing, Sarah," she said, leaning in close, "he's not real, not in the way we think of as real anyway." I frowned, confusion replacing my initial relief. "What do you mean?" "I've seen him, I've heard him speak." Emily nodded. "So have I, but think about it. Has anyone else ever seen him? Has he ever interacted with the world around him in any tangible way?" I thought back, trying to remember a single instance where the man had touched something, moved an object, or been acknowledged by anyone. But me, I couldn't. "He's a manifest," Emily continued, "a physical representation of our deepest fears and insecurities. He appears differently to each person who sees him, but the effect is the same. He isolates us, makes us doubt ourselves, drives us to the brink of madness. It sounded insane, and yet it made a twisted kind of sense the way he always seemed to know exactly where I'd be the way no one else could see. The familiar quality of his voice. So what do we do? I asked, my voice small and scared. How do we make him go away? Emily's face hardened. We face him head on. No more running, no more hiding. We confront our fears, whatever they may be, and we take back control of our lives. She reached into her bag and pulled out 2 small objects, cameras. I realized tiny high-tech ones that could be easily hidden. We're going to document everything, she said. Every appearance, every interaction will build a record so comprehensive, so irrefutable that even if no one else can see him, they won't be able to deny his impact on our lives. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something, a way to fight back against the terror that had consumed my life over the next few days. Emily and I worked tirelessly. We set up cameras in our homes, our workplaces, everywhere. We frequently saw the red-haired man. We kept detailed logs of every sighting, every feeling of unease, and slowly something began to change. The more we focused on documenting the man's presence, the less power he seemed to have over us. His appearances became less frequent, less intense. It was as if by shining a light on our fears, we were slowly banishing them back to the shadows. 1 week after our meeting at the clock tower, I woke up and realized I hadn't seen the red-haired man in 3 days. I called Emily, my heart pounding with excitement. He's gone, I said as soon as she picked up. I haven't seen him, have you? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Emily finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. No, she said, I haven't either. I think we did it, Sarah. We faced our fears, and we won. As I hung up the phone, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The constant fear, the paranoia, the feeling of being watched, it was all gone. In its place was a newfound strength, a confidence I hadn't felt in months. I know now that the red-haired man may never truly be gone. He might reappear in moments of weakness or self-doubt, but I'm no longer afraid of him. I understand now that he's a part of me, a manifestation of my own insecurities and fears. And as long as I face those fears head-on, he has no power over me. To anyone out there who might be seeing their own red-haired man, I want you to know you're not alone, you're not crazy, your fears are real. But they don't define you. Face them, document them, shine a light on them. Because in the end, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And once we understand that we can overcome anything, the first time I heard Timmy talking to his friend in the closet, I thought it was adorable, kids and their imaginary playmates, right? But as the weeks went by and Timmy's stories about his closet buddy became more elaborate and disturbing, I began to wonder if we'd brought more than just our furniture. When we moved into this old house, it started innocently enough. We barely finished unpacking when I overheard Timmy, all of 5 years old, giggling and chattering away in his room. Curious, I peeked and expecting to find him playing with his toys. Instead, he was sitting cross-legged in front of his closet door, talking animatedly to nothing. Who are you talking to, sweetie? I asked, trying to keep my voice light and playful. Timmy turned to me, his big brown eyes wide with excitement. My new friend, Mommy. He lives in the closet, and he's really funny. I played along, asking about this closet-dwelling comedian. Timmy spun a tale about a little boy named Charlie who loved to tell jokes and play games. It all seemed harmless enough, and I was secretly relieved that Timmy was adjusting so well to the move. But as days turned to weeks, Charlie became a constant presence in our lives. Timmy would insist on leaving food out for him, claiming Charlie got hungry at night. He'd beg to stay up late, because a Charlie doesn't like to be alone in the dark. At first, my husband Mark and I indulged it. We both had imaginary friends as kids, and all the parenting books said it was a normal phase. But then things started to change. I began finding strange scratches on me inside of Timmy's closet door. When I asked him about them, he just shrugged and said Charlie gets scared sometimes and tries to get out. Objects started moving around the house. Nothing major. A book left on the coffee table would end up on the kitchen counter, or Timmy's toys would be arranged in odd patterns on his bedroom floor. When questioned, Timmy would always say the same thing: Charlie did it. One night, I woke to the sound of Timmy's laughter echoing down the hallway. Confused and a little annoyed, it was 3 a.m. After all, I trudged to his room. The sight that greeted me sent a chill down my spine. Timmy was sitting on his bed, giggling and clapping his hands. But it wasn't his behavior that frightened me. It was the closet door. It was opening and closing slowly, but steadily, with no visible means of movement. Timmy, I whispered, my voice shaking. What's going on? He turned to me, his face lit up with joy. Charlie's playing peekaboo, Mommy. Isn't it funny? I snatched Timmy up and ran from the room, slamming the door behind us. Mark found us huddled in the living room, Timmy confused, and me in tears. When I told him what I'd seen, he was skeptical, but concerned. We agreed to keep a closer eye on things. The next day, Mark installed a nanny cam in Timmy's room, hidden in a stuffed animal. We watched the footage religiously, But nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. When we weren't there, the closet door remained stubbornly still. As weeks passed, Timmy's stories about Charlie grew darker. He talked about Charlie being sad because his parents were mean to him, about Charlie showing him tricks that sounded suspiciously like ways to hurt people or start fires. When we tried to discourage the friendship, Timmy became uncharacteristically angry. Charlie says you're trying to keep us apart, he shouted during one particularly bad tantrum. He says if you don't stop, he'll have to hurt you. That was the last straw. We called a child psychologist, hoping for some insight into what was happening with our son. Dr. Anderson listened patiently to our story, nodding and taking notes. When we finished, she leaned forward, her face serious. I'd like to speak with Timmy alone, if that's all right, she said. Sometimes children find it easier to open up without their parents present. We agreed, albeit reluctantly. For an hour, we paced the waiting room, imagining all sorts of horrible scenarios. When Dr. Anderson finally called us back in, and her expression was grave, Timmy is a very imaginative child. She began choosing her words carefully, but I'm concerned about the nature of this particular friend, the level of detail in his stories, the violent themes. It's not typical for a child his age. She recommended a series of sessions for Timmy and suggested we consider blessing the house just to cover all our bases. I'm not saying I believe in the supernatural, she added quickly, but sometimes these rituals can provide a sense of closure and security, especially for children. We left her office more confused and worried than ever that night. After tucking Timmy in and checking the closet thoroughly, Mark and I had a long talk. We decided to take Dr. Anderson's advice and have the house blessed. We also agreed that one of us would sleep in Timmy's room for a while just to be safe. The blessing was interesting. The priest seemed skeptical at first, but as he moved through the house, his demeanor changed. Spent an unusually long time in Timmy's room, muttering prayers and sprinkling holy water. When he finished, he turned to us with a solemn expression. There's something here, he said quietly, something old and angry. I've done what I can, but you need to be cautious, and whatever you do, don't engage with it, don't acknowledge it, starve it of attention, and it may lose its power. That night I took the first shift in Timmy's room. I set up a cot next to his bed, determined to stay awake and watchful. But despite my best efforts, I must have dozed off. I woke to the sound of whispering. Timmy was sitting up in bed, talking softly to his closet. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw the closet door was open a crack, and something, a shadow, a presence, I don't know, seemed to be seeping out. Timmy, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Who are you talking to? He turned to me, and in the dim light his eyes looked wrong, too old, too knowing for his little face. Charlie wants to play mommy, he said, his voice eerily calm. He says it's time for you to join the game. The shadow pulsed, growing larger, and I felt an overwhelming sense of malevolence fill the room. Without thinking, I scooped Timmy up and ran. I didn't stop until we were in the car, Mark stumbling out of the house behind us. Confused and scared, we never went back. We left everything, clothes, furniture, toys, and checked into a hotel that very night. In the weeks that followed, as we struggled to rebuild our lives and help Timmy process what had happened, we learned some disturbing facts about our old house. Decades ago, a little boy named Charles had lived there with his abusive parents. One night, neighbors heard screaming and called the police. They found Charles locked in his closet, starved and beaten to death. His parents were never found. Sometimes late at night I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear whispers coming from the dark corners of our new home. But then I look over at Timmy sleeping peacefully, no longer tormented by his friend, and I breathe a sigh of relief. We were lucky we got out, but I often wonder about the next family that moves into that house. Will they hear the whispers from the closet? Will they be strong enough to resist the game that Charlie wants to play? All I know is that I'll never look at a child's imaginary friend the same way again, because sometimes, just sometimes, those friends aren't imaginary at all, and they're certainly not friendly. The moment I stepped into the Wilsons' house, I knew something was off. Maybe it was the eerie silence, broken only by the distant sound of cartoons playing upstairs, or perhaps it was the lingering scent of burnt toast that seemed at odds with the immaculate kitchen. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something I wasn't prepared for. Thanks for coming on such short notice, Jess, Mrs. Wilson had said over the phone just an hour earlier. Tom and I have an emergency work thing, and we really need someone to watch Lily for the night. I'd babysat for the Wilsons dozens of times before. Lily was a sweet bit, if a bit quiet, and the pay was good. Plus, at 17, I was always happy for an excuse to get out of my own house for a while. But something about Mrs. Wilson's voice had seemed strained, almost desperate now, as I stood in their empty living room. That desperation made a lot more sense. Hello, I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the silent house. Lily, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. No answer, just the faint sound of SpongeBob's laugh drifting down from upstairs. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hand trailing along the banister. Family photos lined the wall. Lily's gap, toothed grin in school pictures, vacation snapshots of the Wilsons on the beach, normal happy stuff. So why did looking at them make my skin crawl? Lily's bedroom door was ajar, blue light from her TV flickering across the hallway. Carpet. I knocked gently. Lily, it's Jess, I'm here to babysit. Still no answer. I pushed the door open wider, peering inside. The room was empty. The TV was on all right, but Lily was nowhere to be seen. Her bed was neatly made, stuffed animals arranged in a perfect row against the headboard. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet a chill ran down my spine as I noticed something on Lily's nightstand, a piece of paper folded neatly in half. With trembling fingers, I picked it up and unfolded it. In Lily's childish scrawl it read, "Mommy and Daddy had to go away for a while. They said Jess would take care of me, but I'm scared. The man in the closet says he'll protect me." My blood ran cold. The man in the closet. What the hell was going on? I whirled around, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows, but the room remained empty. And still, that's when my phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. A text from an unknown number. "Having fun. Yet Jess, the game is just beginning. Don't bother trying to leave. Lily needs you." My heart pounding. I tried to call Mrs. Wilson straight to voicemail. Mr. Wilson too, even the emergency contact number they'd left me went unanswered. I was alone in this house with a missing child and a cryptic threatening text. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out and call the police. But what if Lily really was in danger? What if leaving meant abandoning her to whatever sick game this was? Taking a deep breath, I decided to search the rest of the house. Maybe there was a clue, something to explain what was happening. The master bedroom was untouched, beds still made as if no one had slept in it. The guest room was similarly pristine. It wasn't until I reached the study that I found something amiss. The desk was a mess of scattered papers and overturned picture frames. A laptop sat open, its screen dark. As I approached it, suddenly flickered to life, revealing a video feed. My heart nearly stopped. It was Lily. She was huddled in what looked like a small dark space, a closet, maybe hugging her knees to her chest. She wasn't crying, but her eyes were wide with fear. "Oh my God," I whispered, reaching for the laptop. "Lily, can you hear me?" But it wasn't a live feed. The time stamp in the corner showed it was recorded hours ago. I watched helplessly as Lily looked up, apparently responding to something off camera. Her lips moved, but there was no sound. Suddenly a hand entered the frame, an adult's hand reaching for Lily. She didn't resist as it pulled her out of view. The video cutting to black. A moment later, I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This had to be some kind of sick joke, right? A prank gone too far. My phone buzzed again. Another text. "Poor Lily, so trusting, so alone, just like you, Jess. TikTok, find her before it's too late." Panic clawed at my throat. This was real. Lily was in danger, and for some reason I was being dragged into it. I ran back to Lily's room, determined to find some clue I'd missed. As I burst through the door, my eyes fell on the closet. The man in the closet Lily had written with shaking hands. I reached for the doorknob. The closet was empty. Of course, it was what had I expected, but as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A small red light blinking steadily in the back corner of the closet. I pushed aside hanging clothes and stuffed animals, revealing a small camera. It was aimed directly at where I was standing, its red eye watching me impassively. "What the hell?" I muttered, reaching for it. The moment my fingers touched the camera, every light in the house went out. I stumbled back, heart racing as darkness engulfed me. Then from downstairs came the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps slowly climbing the stairs. I froze, terror paralyzing me. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare. But the footsteps kept coming closer and closer in the pitch black. I fumbled for my phone. The screen's light was blinding, but I managed to open the flashlight app. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty doorway. The footsteps had stopped. "Hello," I called out, hating how my voice trembled. "Who's there?" Silence, then a soft giggle, a child's giggle, Lily's giggle. It came from behind me. I spun around the flashlight beam, swinging wildly. For a split second I caught a glimpse of a small figure darting into the closet. The door slammed shut. "Lily," I cried, rushing to the closet. I yanked the door open, but it was empty. No Lily, no camera, nothing but clothes and toys. My phone buzzed again. With trembling hands I looked at the screen. "You're getting warmer, Jess, but time is running out for both of you." Attached was a photo. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized it. It was me, taken just moments ago, standing in front of the open closet, but behind me, barely visible in the shadows, was a tall, dark figure. Its face was blurred, but I could make out the outline of a wide, unnatural grin. A scream built in my throat, but before it could escape, a hand clamped over my mouth, an arm wrapped around my waist, pulling me back against a solid chest. A voice whispered in my ear, low and amused, "We wouldn't want to spoil the surprise, now would we?" I struggled, kicking and clawing, but the grip was like iron. As I fought, I caught a glimpse of movement in the closet. The clothes parted, revealing a hidden door I hadn't Noticed before it swung open silently, revealing a dark passageway beyond time to join the game. Just the voice said Lily's. Waiting, I was dragged towards the secret door, my feet scrabbling uselessly against the carpet. As we crossed the threshold, I managed to turn my head slightly, catching a glimpse of my captor face. It was Mr. Wilson, but his eyes were wrong, cold, and empty like black holes. His mouth was stretched in that same unnatural grin I'd seen in the photo. "Welcome to the family, Jess," he said, his voice distorting into something inhuman. "We've been waiting for you." The hidden door swung shut behind us, plunging us into darkness. The last thing I heard, before losing consciousness, was Lily's giggle echoing from somewhere deep in the bowels of the house. When I came to, I found myself in a small dark room, a closet. Maybe as my eyes adjusted, I saw a familiar figure huddled in the corner. Lily looked up at me, her eyes wide and haunted. "I'm sorry, Jess," she whispered. "I tried to warn you, but once the game starts, it never ends." From beyond the closet door I heard footsteps approaching, heavy, deliberate footsteps, and I realized with a sinking heart that for us the game was just beginning. The knock on my door came at 2:37 a.m. I remember the time precisely because I'd been staring at my alarm clock for hours, unable to sleep. The sound jolted me out of my restless thoughts, my heart leaping into my throat. Who could it be at this ungodly hour? I hesitated, debating whether to answer or pretend I wasn't home, but then I heard his voice muffled through the door, but unmistakable. "Megan, it's me, please. I need to talk to you." Jake, my ex-boyfriend, the man I'd spent the last 6 months trying to forget against my better judgment. I got up and padded to the door. I didn't open it. "Not yet, Jake. What are you doing here?" His voice came back, desperate and pleading. "I'm sorry, I know it's late, but I didn't know where else to go. Please, can I come in just for a minute?" I should have said no, should have told him to leave, to never contact me again, but something in his voice, a raw vulnerability I'd never heard before, made me pause. Slowly I undid the chain and opened the door. Jake stood there looking nothing like the confident, charming man I'd once loved. His clothes were rumpled, his hair a mess, but it was his eyes that caught me off guard. They were wild, filled with a fear I couldn't understand. "Thank you," he breathed, stepping inside. "I'm sorry, I know this is crazy, but I didn't know who else to turn to." I closed the door, crossing my arms over my chest. "What's going on, Jake? Why are you here?" He ran a hand through his hair, pacing my small living room. "You're going to think I'm insane." "Hell, I think I'm insane. But I swear, Megan, it's true, all of it, all of what I asked." A knot of unease forming in my stomach. Jake took a deep breath, then looked me straight in the eye. "I think someone's trying to kill me. And I think it might be my wife." The words hit me like a physical blow. His wife, the woman he'd left me for, the reason our 3-year relationship had crumbled into dust. I'd never met her, never even seen a picture. Jake had been careful to keep that part of his life separate, even as he'd torn mine apart. "Your wife," I repeated, my voice flat. "The one you told me you were leaving me for, because she was your soulmate." "That wife," Jake winced. "I deserve that. I deserve worse, I know. But please, Megan, you have to believe me. Strange things have been happening, accidents that aren't really accidents. I think she's trying to make it look like I'm going crazy, but I swear I'm not. Part of me wanted to throw him out, to tell him his marital problems weren't my concern anymore, but another part, the part that had loved him, that maybe still did despite everything, couldn't ignore the genuine terror in his eyes. "Sit down," I said with a sigh. "Start from the beginning." For the next hour, Jake spun a tale that sounded like something out of a psychological thriller. It had started small. He said things going missing only to turn up in strange places, the brakes on his car mysteriously failing, food that tasted off leaving him violently ill. At first I thought I was just being paranoid. Jake said, his hands shaking slightly as he clutched a mug of coffee I'd made him. But then I found this. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through it before handing it to me. On the screen was a blurry photo of what looked like a notebook. The handwriting was messy, but I could make out a list of dates and times along with cryptic notes like "break line, second attempt, an increased dosage, build tolerance." I found it in her desk drawer, Jake explained. When I confronted her about it, she laughed. It offset it. Was research for a novel she was writing. But the dates, Megan, they match up perfectly with all the accidents I've been having. I handed the phone back, my mind reeling. It sounded insane, like the ramblings of a paranoid man. And yet there was something in Jake's eyes, a desperation that felt too raw to be faked. "Have you gone to the police?" I asked. Jake shook his head with what proof? A blurry photo of a notebook. "They'd laughed me out of the station, plus her brother's a cop. I don't know who I can trust." One rubbed my temples, feeling a headache coming on. "So why come to me? What do you expect me to do?" He leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "I need a place to stay, just for a few days, somewhere where she won't think to look. I need time to gather evidence, to figure out what to do next. Please, Megan, I know I have no right to ask, but you're the only person I trust." One should have said no, should have told him to leave to figure out his own problems. But despite everything he'd put me through, despite the pain and heartbreak, I couldn't turn him away, not when he looked so lost, so afraid. "Okay," I said finally, "you can stay onto the couch, but just for a few days, Jake." And then you need to figure this out. Relief flooded his face. Thank you, God, Megan, thank you, I promise. I'll make this up to you somehow. As I got him settled on the couch with a blanket and pillow, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a huge mistake. But what else could I do if even half of what he told me was true? His life could be in danger that night. I barely slept. Every creak of the apartment, every distant car horn had me jolting awake, convinced Jake's mysterious wife had somehow found us. But morning came without incident, sunlight streaming through my bedroom window. As if to mock the dark fears of the night, I found Jake in the kitchen making coffee. He looked better than he had last night, still tired, still on edge, but more put together. Morning, he said, offering me a tentative smile. I hope you don't mind. I thought I'd make breakfast. At least I could do. We ate in awkward silence, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. So what's your plan? You can't hide out here forever. Jake nodded, his expression turning serious. I know, I've been thinking about it all night. I need to get concrete proof of what she's doing. Maybe set up some hidden cameras in the house, catch her in the ACT. I raised an eyebrow. Isn't that illegal? Probably, he admitted. But what choice do I have? If I don't do something, I'm afraid I'll end up dead. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous energy. Jake spent hours on my laptop researching spy cameras and legal precedents. I tried to go about my normal routine, but it was impossible to focus with him there, a constant reminder of what I'd lost and what I was risking by helping him. As night fell, Jake grew more agitated. He paced the living room, checking his phone obsessively. She's going to realize I'm gone soon, he muttered. If she hasn't already. God, what if she comes looking for me? I was about to reassure him when a sharp knock at the door made us both freeze. Jake's eyes went wide with panic. It's her, he whispered. She's found me. Don't be ridiculous, I said, though my own heart was racing. It's probably just a neighbor. But as I approached the door, I heard a voice that sent chills down my spine. Megan, it's Claire, Jake's wife. I know he's in there. Please, I need to talk to you both. I turned to Jake, who had gone pale as a ghost. How did she find us? I hissed. He shook his head, looking as bewildered as I felt. I don't know, I swear, Megan. I didn't tell her where I was going. Another knock, more insistent this time. Please, Megan, it's not what you think. Jake needs help, professional help. Let me in, and I can explain everything. I hesitated, torn between my instinct to protect Jake and the growing seed of doubt in my mind. What if he really was paranoid? What if I'd been drawn into some kind of shared delusion? Don't open it, Jake pleaded. She'll kill me, she'll kill us both. But even as he spoke, I found myself moving towards the door. I had to know the truth, had to see for myself what kind of woman had stolen Jake away from me. With trembling hands, I undid the chain and opened the door seal. Was nothing like I'd imagined. She was small, delicate, looking with kind eyes that were red-rimmed from crying. Thank you, she said softly. I'm so sorry to barge in like this, but I've been so worried. I stepped aside, letting her in. Jake backed away, pressing himself against the far wall. Stay away from me, he growled. Megan, don't listen to her. She'll try to convince you I'm crazy, but I'm not. I'm not. Claire's face crumpled with a mixture of pain and sympathy. Oh, Jake, she sighed, I wish you could see yourself right now. This isn't you, this is the paranoia talking. She turned to me, her eyes pleading. Megan, I'm so sorry you got dragged into this. Jake's been struggling with mental health issues for months now. He stopped taking his medication, and well, you can see the result. I looked between them, my mind reeling. Jake Wildy and trembling, Claire, the picture of concerned compassion, who was telling the truth, who was the real threat. As the night wore on, the truth began to unravel. Medical records, therapy notes, text messages from concerned friends and family, all painting a picture of a man spiraling into paranoid delusions, convinced his loving wife was out to get him. By dawn, Jake was gone, taken away by paramedics, sedated for his own safety. Claire thanked me tearfully for keeping him safe, for giving her the chance to help him. But as I watched the ambulance drive away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that somewhere in this tangled web of truth and lies I'd missed something crucial. And I wondered, with a chill running down my spine, if I'd ever know for sure who the real villain of this story was. I never believed in ghosts until the night I woke up to find a stranger standing at the foot of my bed. At first, I thought it was just a vivid dream, a product of too much late-night pizza and horror movies. But as I blinked away the fog of sleep, the figure remained solid and undeniably real in the pale moonlight filtering through my curtains. He was tall unnaturally, so with limbs that seemed too long for his body. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me, boring into my soul with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I tried to scream, to move, to do anything, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own bed, as this otherworldly intruder loomed over me. Seconds stretched into an eternity as we stared at each other in silence. Then slowly, deliberately, he raised a finger to where his lips should be, as if shushing me. The gesture was almost gentle, but it filled me with a terror so profound I thought my heart might stop. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, He was gone one moment, he was there a dark silhouette against my bedroom wall, and the next nothing I blinked, and he had vanished into thin air. The spell of paralysis broke, and I shot up in bed gasping for air. My hands shook as I fumbled for the bedside lamp, flooding the room with harsh yellow light. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, but I was alone, no sign of the stranger. No evidence that he had ever been there at all had I. Imagined it a particularly vivid nightmare, perhaps, but even as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, I knew deep in my gut that it had been real. Something had been in my room watching me sleep, and something told me it would be back. Sleep was impossible after that. I spent the rest of the night with every light in the apartment blazing, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. When dawn finally broke, I felt hollow-eyed and jittery, like I'd mainlined a gallon of coffee. I called in sick to work, unable to face the thought of leaving my apartment. Instead, I spent the day researching, desperate for some explanation of what I'd experienced: sleep paralysis, hypnagogic hallucinations, or something more supernatural. The internet was a rabbit hole of ghost stories and paranormal theories. I read accounts of shadow people, of malevolent spirits that preyed on the sleeping. Each story sent a fresh chill down my spine, but none quite matched what I'd seen. As night fell again, I found myself dreading the thought of sleep. What if he came back? What if this time he did more than just watch? I fortified myself as best I could, salt lines at the windows and doors, though I felt ridiculous doing it. A kitchen knife on the bedside table, more for my peace of mind than any real sense of protection. And finally, propped up in bed, with every light blazing, I waited. Hours ticked by, my eyes grew heavy, my thoughts fuzzy with exhaustion. I was just starting to think that maybe, just maybe, it had all been in my head when the lights flickered once, twice, and then darkness fell, complete and absolute, as if someone had thrown a heavy blanket over the entire world. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my phone, desperate for any source of light. But it was dead, the screen stubbornly black, no matter how many times I jabbed at the power button. And then I felt it, a presence in the room, a weight in the air that hadn't been there before, slowly fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run, to hide. I turned my head towards the foot of the bed. He was there, taller than I remembered, his head nearly brushing the ceiling. In the pitch darkness, I could see him clearly, as if he emitted his own faint, on other words, worldly glow. And this time I could see his face. It was wrong, features that seemed to shift and change the longer I looked, never quite settling into anything recognizably human. But his eyes, God, his eyes, they were ancient, filled with a knowledge and hunger that made me feel small, insignificant, like an insect about to be crushed underfoot. Who are you? I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible, even in the silence of the room. And what do you want? He tilted his head, the movement unnaturally fluid. When he spoke, his voice was like gravel grinding against glass, painfully beautiful and utterly alien. I am the Watcher, he said, and you, little one, have been chosen. Chosen, the word echoed in my mind, filling me with a dread I couldn't explain. Chosen for what? The being the Watcher took a step closer, looming over me. I pressed myself back against the headboard, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. To see, he said, to know, to bear witness to the truths that lie beyond the veil of your reality. As he spoke, the darkness around us seemed to deepen, to take on a life of its own. Shapes moved in the corners of my vision, twisted things that vanished when I tried to look at them directly. I don't understand, I said, my voice shaking. I don't want this, please, just leave me alone. The Watcher's face twisted into something that might have been a smile on a human. On him it was terrifying. It is not a choice, little one. The seeing has already begun. You cannot unknow what you have seen, cannot unsee what your eyes have been open to. As if to prove his point, he gestured towards the window reluctantly. I followed his gaze. The world outside was changed. The familiar street I'd looked out on every day for years was transformed. Buildings twisted and warped, their architecture impossible, and alien shadows moved with purpose, coalescing into shapes that hurt my mind to look at. And in the sky I recoiled, a screen building in my throat. What I saw up there was too much, too vast and terrible for my human mind to comprehend. It was as if a veil had been torn away, revealing the true nature of the universe. And it was horrifying. Stop it, I cried, covering my eyes. Make it go away. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and suddenly the visions were gone. The room was back to normal, the familiar glow of street lights filtering through my curtains. But the Watcher remained, his presence a constant reminder that nothing would ever truly be normal again. Why me? I asked, my voice small and broken. Why show me these things? The Watcher regarded me silently for a long moment. When he spoke again, there was something almost like pity in his voice. Because you have the capacity to see, to understand, not fully, not yet, but in time you will be our eyes in this world, our voice, our herald. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I don't want this, I can't handle it. You can, he said, his voice firm. You must, the choice was made long ago. Little one, before you were born, before your parents were born, your Bloodline was chosen, and now the time has come for you to fulfill your purpose." With that he began to fade, his form growing translucent. But before he disappeared entirely, he leaned in close, his alien features inches from my face. "We will return," he whispered, "and each time you will see more, no more, until the day comes when you are ready to truly join us." And then he was gone, leaving me alone in my suddenly too small bedroom. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I found a way to block out what I'd seen, to go back to my normal life. But the Watcher was right. Once your eyes have been opened to the truth of reality, there's no going back. In the days and weeks that followed, I caught glimpses of things that shouldn't exist, shadows that moved against the flow of light, doorways that appeared and disappeared in the blink of an eye. And sometimes, just sometimes, I'd look up at the night sky and see something vast and unknowable peering back at me. I don't sleep much anymore, can't bear to close my eyes knowing what might be waiting for me in the darkness. Instead I write, I document everything I see, everything I experience. Maybe it's my way of trying to make sense of it all, or maybe it's exactly what the Watcher wanted for me, to bear witness, to spread the knowledge of what lies beyond. All I know is that the world is so much bigger, so much stranger than I ever imagined, and I'm no longer sure if that's a blessing or a curse. So if you're reading this, consider it a warning. The next time you wake up in the middle of the night and feel a presence in your room, don't open your eyes, don't look, because once you see, you can never unsee. And trust me, there are some truths that mankind was never meant to know. The first thing that hit me when I entered the Johnsons' basement was the smell. It was thick, cloying, a sickly sweet odor that clung to the back of my throat and made my eyes water. I'd agreed to house sit for the weekend, feed their cat, water the plants, simple stuff, but Mrs. Johnson had been oddly insistent that I check the basement each day. Make sure the dehumidifier was running. "It gets so damp down there," she said, a strange tension in her voice. Now standing at the foot of the creaky wooden stairs, I understood why the basement was like something out of a horror movie. Bare concrete walls, a single flickering bulb casting more shadows than light, and everywhere, in every corner, were dolls, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, their glassy eyes all seeming to follow me as I moved deeper into the room. "What the hell?" I muttered, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. The Johnsons had always seemed so normal, a bit quiet maybe, but friendly enough, the kind of neighbors who'd wave from their porch, but never invite you over for a barbecue. Nothing in our brief interactions had prepared me for this. I picked my way carefully through the clutter, trying not to touch anything. There were porcelain dolls with delicate painted faces, rag dolls with button eyes, even a few that looked handmade, their stitching crude and uneven, but it was the one in the center of the room that caught my eye. It sat on a small wooden chair, larger than the others, almost the size of a real child. Unlike the rest, its eyes weren't glass or button, but seemed to be made of some dark polished stone. They gleamed in the dim light, and I could have sworn they followed me as I approached. Something about it made my skin crawl, but I couldn't look away. Its dress was old-fashioned, yellowed with age, and its hair was real long dark strands that felt wrong, somehow too organic among all this manufactured creepiness. As I leaned in for a closer look, my elbow knocked against a shelf. A smaller doll toppled, hitting the concrete with a sharp crack. I jumped, my heart racing, and in that moment of distraction, I could have sworn I saw the big doll's head turn just slightly to keep me in view. "Okay, that's enough," I said aloud, trying to steady my nerves. "Dehumidifier is running, everything's fine, time to go." I turned to leave, but something made me pause, a sound so faint I wasn't sure I'd actually heard it, like a whisper or the rustle of fabric. Slowly, reluctantly, I turned back. The doll hadn't moved, of course it hadn't. It was just a doll, no matter how lifelike it seemed. But as I stared at it, a chill ran down my spine, because now unmistakably its lips were curved into a smile I could have sworn wasn't there before. I ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me, not stopping until I was out of the house and gulping in great lungfuls of fresh air on the front lawn. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone, ready to call the Johnson to demand an explanation, but as the adrenaline faded I felt foolish. What was I going to say? "Your creepy doll collection scared me." I imagined Mrs. Johnson's confused voice, Mr. Johnson's disapproval. They'd never ask me to house it again, and honestly the money was too good to pass up. "Get it together," I muttered to myself. "It's just a bunch of old dolls, weird but harmless." I spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the unease, busying myself with the usual house-sitting tasks, but as night fell I found myself avoiding the basement door, taking the long way around to get from the kitchen to the living room. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with strange dreams. I woke several times, sure I'd heard something, footsteps maybe, or that same whisper, soft rustle, but the house was always still and silent. When I went to check the next morning, I steeled myself to go back down to the basement. The dehumidifier needed to be emptied. After all, I couldn't let my irrational fears get in the way of doing the job I'd been paid for. But as I descended the stairs, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The smell was stronger, almost overwhelming, and the dolls, they'd moved. I was sure of it. The careful paths I'd picked through the clutter were gone. The dolls arranged in new unsettling patterns, and the big one, the one with the stone eyes, was gone from its chair. My heart pounding, I searched the room, half expecting it to jump out at me from behind a shelf, but it was nowhere to be seen. What I did find, hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a door, small, almost child-sized, its edges caked with what looked like rust, or maybe dried blood. It was ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of the house and never come back, but a morbid curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. What was behind that door? Where did it lead? Cursing my own stupidity, I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam seemed feeble in the oppressive darkness of the basement, but it was better than nothing. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the door. The hinges creaked as I pushed it open wider, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The space beyond was pitch black, the flashlight beam swallowed up after just a few feet, but I could make out the start of a narrow tunnel, its walls rough hewn stone. Hello, I called out, my voice shaking. Is anyone down there? No response, just the echo of my own voice bouncing back at me from the darkness. I don't know what possessed me to step through that door. Maybe it was the need to prove to myself that there was a rational explanation for all of this. Maybe it was simple, foolish bravery. Whatever it was, I soon found myself creeping down the tunnel, one hand trailing along the damp stone wall. For balance, the tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning until I lost all sense of direction. The air grew colder, damper, that sickly sweet smell growing stronger with each step. And then, just as I was about to give up and turn back, the tunnel opened up into a larger space. My flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing glimpses of horror that my mind struggled to process. Tables laden with cruel-looking instruments, jars filled with things that might once have been human, and everywhere more dolls. But these were wrong. Miss Chopin, as if made from parts that didn't quite fit together. Some moved, twitching and writhing in a grotesque parody of life. And there in the center of it all stood the big doll. Only it wasn't a doll at all. Its skin was pale, waxy, but undeniably real. Its eyes, the dark stone eyes, blinked as they fixed on me. It smiled, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp, a little too numerous. When it spoke, its voice was like rusted metal scraping against bone. We've been waiting for you. It said it's time to join our family. I ran, blind panic giving me speed I didn't know I possessed. I sprinted back up the tunnel. I could hear things moving behind me, the patter of small feet and the rustle of cloth. Childlike giggles echoed off the stone walls, growing closer with each passing second. I burst out of the small door, slamming it shut behind me. But the basement provided no relief. The dolls were all facing me now, their painted smiles somehow menacing in the dim light. I didn't stop. Up the stairs, out of the house, into my car. I drove until the gas tank was nearly empty, not caring where I ended up as long as it was far away from that house. I never went back, never answered the Johnsons' calls or responded to their increasingly angry texts. I moved to a new city, changed my name, did everything I could to put that night behind me. But sometimes late at night, I still hear those giggles, still see those stone eyes watching me from the shadows. And I know with a certainty that chills me to my core that someday they'll find me, that someday I'll join their family, whether I want or not. So if you're ever asked to house hit for the Johnsons, or any family that seems just a little too normal, a little too insistent about checking their basement run, and don't look back. Because some doors once opened can never truly be closed. Again the engine sputtered and died with a final pathetic wheeze. I coasted to a stop on the shoulder of the deserted highway, the silence suddenly deafening after hours of driving. As I tried the ignition again and again, each attempt more desperate than the last, I felt a growing sense of dread. We were stuck in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, with night falling fast. What's wrong? Sarah asked from the passenger seat, her voice tight with worry. I forced a smile I didn't feel. Probably just overheated. I'm sure it'll start up again in a few minutes. But as the minutes ticked by and the car stubbornly refused to come back to life, that reassurance rang hollow. The sun was sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and purple that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. Now it just felt ominous. We'd been on our way to visit Sarah's parents, taking the scenic route through winding back roads and dense forests. It had seemed romantic at first, just the two of us on an adventure. Now I was cursing my decision to avoid the main highways. Just as I was about to suggest we try calling for help, though I doubted we'd have any cell service out here, headlights appeared in the distance. Relief flooded through me as an old pickup truck slowed to a stop beside us. The driver, a friendly-looking older man with a weathered face and kind eyes, rolled down his window. You folks having some trouble? I explained our situation, and he nodded sympathetically. That's a tough break. Nearest town's about 20 miles down the road. But I'd be happy to give you a lift. Got a friend who owns a garage. He might be able to help you out. I glanced at Sarah, saw the hesitation in her eyes that mirrored my own. Getting into a stranger's car went against everything we'd ever been taught. But what choice did we have? That would be great, thank you, I heard myself say. As we climbed into the truck, the man introduced himself as Frank. He chatted amiably as we drove, asking about our trip and sharing stories about the area. Despite my initial reservations, I found myself relaxing. Frank seemed genuinely kind, just a good Samaritan, helping out some stranded travelers. It wasn't until we'd been driving for about 15 minutes that I realized something was wrong. The forest on either side of the road was getting denser, the trees pressing in closer to the highway. And hadn't Frank said the town was 20 miles away, we should be seeing some signs of civilization by now. Frank, I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. How much further is it to town? He glanced at me, and for a split second I saw something in his eyes that made my blood run cold, a hunger, a gleam of malice that hadn't been there before. Oh, not too far now, he said, his tone still friendly, but with an undercurrent I couldn't quite place. Just a bit further down this road. I felt Sarah tense beside me, her hand finding mine and squeezing tight. She'd noticed it too. Something was very, very wrong. The next few minutes were among the longest of my life. I tried to think of a way out, some excuse to get Frank to stop the truck, but we were in the middle of nowhere, and I had a sinking feeling that any attempt to flee would end badly for us. Just as the panic was threatening to overwhelm me, lights appeared ahead, but it wasn't the welcoming glow of a town. Instead, a ramshackle collection of buildings came into view, barely visible in the gloom. Frank turned off the main road onto a rutted dirt track, the truck bouncing and jolting as we approached what looked like an old farmhouse. Here we are, Frank announced cheerfully, as if this decrepit property was the thriving town he'd promised. Let's get you folks inside, and we'll see about that car of yours. As we climbed out of the truck, I noticed other vehicles parked haphazard around the yard. Some looked like they'd been there for years, slowly rusting away. Others were newer, and with a jolt of horror, I recognized one as the same model as our broken-down car. Frank ushered us towards the house, his hand on my back, feeling less like a friendly gesture and more like a threat. My family's real hospitable, he was saying. They love having guests. The front door creaked open before we reached it, and a woman stepped out onto the porch in the dim light from the single bare bulb above the door. Her features seemed to shift and waver, never quite settling into a recognizable face. Welcome, dears, she said, her voice sickly sweet. We've been waiting for you. That was at the final confirmation that this was no act of kindness, but something far more sinister. I grabbed Sarah's hand and turned to run, but Frank's grip on my shoulder tightened painfully. Now, he chided, all pretense of friendliness gone from his voice. That's no way to treat your hosts. Come inside, we insist. What followed was a nightmare. I still struggled to fully comprehend. The inside of the farmhouse was a maze of dark corridors and locked doors. We were separated, Sarah's screams echoing through the house as she was dragged away. I fought, kicked, clawed at my captors, but there were too many of them, hands in the darkness, faces that seemed to melt and reform with each blink of my eyes. I was thrown into a small windowless room that smelled of damp earth and decay. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I realized with horror that the walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, each showing a different person. Some were smiling, caught in happier moments. Others wore expressions of terror that matched how I felt. And with growing dread, I recognized some of the faces, missing persons I'd seen on the news, or milk cartons, people who had vanished without a trace. Their disappearances unsolved mysteries until now. I don't know how long I was in that room, hours, maybe days. Time lost all meaning in the perpetual darkness. Occasionally someone would slide a tray of food through a slot in the door. If you could call the unidentifiable slop they provided food, I ate it, hating myself for it, but knowing I needed to keep up my strength if I was going to find a way out of this hell. The worst part was the not knowing what had happened to Sarah. Was she alive? Were they torturing her? Or worse, the possibilities my mind conjured were almost worse than any reality could be. And then one day or night, who could tell, the door opened. Frank stood there, that same friendly smile on his face, as if we were still just travelers he'd helped on the side of the road. Time for you to meet the family properly, he said, gesturing for me to follow him. I thought about refusing, about fighting back, but what was the point? I was weak. Captivity, outnumbered and completely lost in this labyrinthine house. My only hope was to play along, to look for an opportunity to escape. Frank led me through twisting corridors, past rooms where I caught glimpses of unspeakable things, and finally into what must have once been a dining room. A long table dominated the space, and seated around it were people or things that looked like people at first glance, but as I stared their features seemed to shift and change, never quite settling into anything human. And at the head of the table, in a high-backed chair that looked more like a throne, sat a figure that defied description. It was as if someone had tried to create a person from half Remembered descriptions, getting all the details, just slightly wrong. Welcome the figure, said, its voice a cacophony of sounds that somehow formed words. We've been waiting so long for you to join us. As it spoke, I saw Sarah. She was seated at the table, her eyes glassy and unfocused. But she was alive. Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by a renewed determination. We were going to get out of here. Somehow. What do you want from us? I managed to ask, my voice hoarse from disuse. The figure's face twisted into what might have been a smile. Why? We want you to be part of our family, to stay with us forever. As it spoke, I noticed something, a small remote control, sitting on the table next to the figure's hand. And suddenly I understood the shifting faces, the impossibly large house, the way Frank had found us so conveniently on that lonely road. It was all an illusion, a complex, terrifying illusion. But an illusion nonetheless. In that moment, I made a choice, a reckless, possibly suicidal choice, but the only one I could see. I lunged for the remote, my fingers closing around it. Just as hands grabbed at me from all sides, I hit buttons randomly, desperately, and the world around us flickered and changed. The monstrous family melted away, replaced by ordinary-looking people with expressive shock and anger. The grand dining room became a dingy basement filled with complex machinery and computer screens. In the chaos that followed, I found Sarah, her eyes cleared as whatever drug they'd given her wore off. Together we fought our way out of the basement, out of the farmhouse, into the cool night air. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out. Ran until we found a real town with real people who called the police when they saw our battered, terrified state. The authorities found the farmhouse, of course, found evidence of dozens of abductions of a family that had been preying on travelers for generations. But they never found Frank or the figure at the head of the table. They had vanished like smoke in the wind. Sometimes late at night, I still hear Frank's friendly voice offering us a ride, still see those shifting inhuman faces, and I wonder with a chill that goes bone deep if they're still out there, still waiting on lonely roads for unsuspecting travelers, still looking to add to their twisted, impossible family. So if you're ever driving on a deserted highway and your car breaks down, be careful who you accept help from, because some families are best left alone and some invitations should never be accepted. The night I discovered the truth about my apartment building was the night I stopped believing in coincidences. It started with a noise, a soft rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from inside the walls. At first I dismissed it as old pipes or maybe a rodent problem, but as the days passed and the tapping grew more insistent, more deliberate, I began to suspect that something far stranger was at work. I'd moved into the Blackwood apartments just 3 months earlier, drawn by the low rent and the building's quirky charm. It was an old place, all creaky floorboards and ornate moldings with a history that stretched back to the 1920s. The landlord, a thin, nervous man named Mr. Garrett, had been oddly insistent that I take the apartment on the 5th floor, even though there were vacancies on lower level s. Better view, he said with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes, and quieter too. You'll hardly hear a peep from the other tenants. At the time, I'd been grateful for the solitude, fresh out of a messy breakup and starting a new job. I craved the peace and quiet, but now as I lay awake, night after night, listening to that incessant tapping, I began to wonder if there was another reason Mr. Garrett had been so keen to isolate me up here. It was on a Tuesday night, exactly 2 weeks after the tapping began, that things took a turn for the bizarre. I'd finally worked up the courage to investigate the source of the noise. Armed with a flashlight and a screwdriver, I dug out of my junk drawer. As I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to pinpoint the exact location of the sound, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, muffled and distant, but unmistakably human, and it was calling my name. Emily, it whispered, the sound seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Emily, help us. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. This couldn't be real. I was sleep-deprived, imagining things. But even as I tried to rationalize it, the voice came again, louder this time. Please, Emily, we don't have much time. With shaking hands, I began to pry at the wallpaper, carrying away strips to reveal the plaster beneath, and there, hidden behind decades of paint and paper, I found a small ornate grate. As I peered through it, I caught a glimpse of movement in the darkness beyond. Hello, I called out, my voice trembling. Who's there? A face appeared at the grate so suddenly that I fell back with a startled cry. It was a woman, her features gaunt and pale in the beam of my flashlight. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and hope. Thank God, she breathed. We thought no one would ever hear us. Over the next hour, huddled by that small opening in my wall, I learned the impossible truth. The woman's name was Sarah, and she claimed to have been trapped in a hidden space between the walls for over 50 years. She wasn't alone. There were others, dozens of them, all lured to the Blackwood apartments over the decades and never seen again. It's the building, Sarah explained, her voice tight with urgency. It's alive somehow. It feeds on us, keeps us trapped, suspended in time. We don't age, don't die, but we can't escape either. I listened, my mind reeling as Sarah told me about the Blackwood's dark history, how it had been. Built by a man obsessed with immortality, who had somehow imbued the very structure with a twisted, hungry life of its own, how it lured in tenants, slowly isolating them before swallowing them into its walls. But you're different, Sarah said, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. You can hear us, you can help us break free. I wanted to believe it was all an elaborate hoax, some sick prank by the other tenants, but deep down I knew it was true. It explained the odd behavior of Mr. Garrett, the strange noises I'd been hearing, the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to permeate the entire building. What can I do, I asked, surprising myself with my own willingness to accept this insane situation. Sarah's face lit up with relief. There's a room in the basement, she said, hidden behind the old boiler. Inside it you'll find the building's heart. Destroy it, and you'll set us all free. It sounded simple enough, but I knew it wouldn't be as I made my way down to the basement that night, armed with nothing but a kitchen knife and my own determination. I could feel the building's awareness pressing down on me. The stairs creaked ominously under my feet. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, and more than once I heard what sounded like whispered voices urging me to turn back. The basement was a maze of rusted pipes and ancient machinery, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. I found the boiler easily enough, a massive iron monstrosity that looked like it hadn't been used in decades, but try as I might, I couldn't find any sign of a hidden room behind it. Just as I was about to give up, I heard it, the tapping, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. It was coming from inside the boiler itself. With a sense of dread, I realized what I had to do. The door to the boiler was rusted shut, but desperation gave me strength. It took all my effort, but finally, with a screech of protesting metal, it swung open. The interior of the boiler was impossibly large, defying the laws of physics. A narrow passageway stretched out before me, lined with pulsing, organic-looking walls, and at the end I could see a faint reddish glow. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of this nightmare and never look back, but the thought of Sarah and the others trapped for decades in this monstrous building gave me the courage to press on. The passageway seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. More than once I felt the floor shift beneath my feet, as if the building was trying to disorient me, but I kept going, following the sound of that incessant tapping. Finally, I emerged into a vast chamber that couldn't possibly fit within the confines of the Blackwood apartments. And there in the center of the room was the heart. It was a massive pulsing thing, more machine than organ. Pipes and wires snaked out from it in all directions, disappearing into the walls, and embedded in its surface were faces, hundreds of them, contorted in expressions of agony and fear. I recognized Sarah among them, her eyes meeting mine with a silent plea. As I approached, knife in hand, I felt the building's fury. The walls began to contract, the floor beneath me buckling and heaving. A howling wind filled the chamber, and I heard Mr. Garrett's voice bellowing from everywhere at once, "Stop, you don't know what you're doing. The Blackwood must survive." But it was too late. With all my strength, I plunged the knife into the heart of the building. There was a moment of resistance, and then the world exploded. I woke up on the sidewalk outside the Blackwood apartments, surrounded by debris and dazed, disoriented people. The building was gone, collapsed in on itself as if it had never existed, and all around me were the former tenants, not just from my time one, but from decades past. Sarah was there, looking older now, but free, tears of joy streaming down her face. In the days that followed, as the authorities tried to make sense of what had happened, I learned the full extent of the Blackwood's evil. Hundreds of people had vanished within its walls over the years, their disappearances written off as unsolved mysteries. Now they were free, trying to adjust to a world that had moved on without them. As for me, I've developed a healthy distrust of old buildings and too good to be true rental agreements. I sleep with the lights on most nights, and the sound of tapping sends me into a cold sweat. But sometimes when I pass by the empty lot where the Blackwood once stood, I feel a sense of pride, because on that impossible night, I fa the impossible, and I won the day I started my new job as a night security guard at Oakwood Mall. I never imagined I'd end up uncovering a secret that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was supposed to be an easy gig: patrol the empty corridors, make sure no one broke in after hours, maybe catch up on some reading during the quiet stretches. But from that very first shift, I knew something was off about this place. It started with the shadows. You'd expect a mall after dark to be full of them, sure. But these were different. They seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, always just at the edge of my peripheral vision. And sometimes when I turned a corner or entered a new section of the mall, I could have sworn I saw figures darting out of sight. I tried to rationalize it, tricks of the light and overactive imagination fueled by too many late-night horror movies. But as the weeks went by, the strange occurrences only escalated. It was about a month into the job when I first heard the whispers. I was doing my usual rounds, flashlight beams sweeping across the darkened storefronts, when a sound caught my attention. It was coming from the old fountain in the center of the Mall, the one that hadn't worked in years. As I approached, the whispers grew louder. I couldn't make out words exactly, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. My hands were shaking as I shone my light into the dry basin of the fountain. Nothing, just cracked tiles and years of accumulated dirt. But as I turned to leave, my light caught something etched into the stone rim, numbers carved so faintly I almost missed them. 07 Tour to 13 1989, a date. But what did it mean? That night marked the beginning of my obsession. I started researching the mall's history, digging through old newspapers and local records. Oakwood Mall had opened in the early 80s, a standard suburban shopping center. Nothing remarkable about it really, except there had been an incident on July 13th. 1989, the exact date I'd found carved into the fountain. A group of teenagers had gone missing. They'd last been seen at the mall, but extensive searches had turned up nothing. The case had gone cold, eventually fading from public memory. But the mall remembered, and now it seemed it wanted me to know the truth. Over the next few weeks, I found more clues. Snippets of conversation caught on the mall's ancient intercom system, always cutting out before I could make sense of them. Strange symbols appearing in the condensation on windows, and always those moving shadows, just out of sight. My coworkers started to notice the change in me. Dark circles under my eyes from sleepless days spent researching. Jumpiness, paranoia. They joked that the job was getting to me, that I was letting my imagination run wild in the empty mall. If only they knew. It all came to a head on a night in late October. I was making my final rounds before the end of my shift, when every light in the mall suddenly went out. Not just the ones that were supposed to be on for security, every single bulb, even the emergency lights in the pitch darkness. I heard it, footsteps echoing through the corridors, not the steady pace of a fellow security guard, but the erratic, excited steps of multiple people laughing, talking. It sounded like a group of teenagers out for a night of fun. My heart pounding, I followed the sounds. They led me to a part of the mall I'd never paid much attention to before. A plain wall between two stores, unremarkable in every way, except now in the beam of my flashlight, I could see the outline of a door that shouldn't exist. With trembling hands I reached out and turned the handle. It opened with a creak that seemed to echo forever. Beyond was a corridor that looked like it belonged in the 1980s. Neon lights flickered overhead, illuminating posters for movies and in bands long since forgotten, and at the end of the hall a group of teenagers turned to look at me. Their clothes, their hair, everything about them screamed 1989. One of them, a girl with big hair and a denim jacket, spoke. "Are you here to let us out?" she asked, her voice hopeful, but tinged with fear. We've been waiting so long. In that moment, I understood, somehow impossible. Possibly, I was looking at the missing teenagers from 1989, trapped in some kind of time bubble or parallel dimension, never aging, never escaping, just waiting for 35 years for someone to find them. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell them yes, I was here to help, but before I could get the words out, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around, coming face to face with Mr. Hadley, the mall's owner, a man who I suddenly realized hadn't aged a day since the photos I'd seen of him from the 80s. Now, he said, his voice oily and cold, "We can't have you spoiling the fun. Can we? These kids are the heart of the mall, their youth, their energy. It keeps this place alive, and we wouldn't want it to die, would we?" As he spoke, I noticed others gathering behind him. Other employees I'd seen around the mall, all of whom should have been much older than they appeared, all wearing the same cold, hungry expression. As Hadley, I realized then that I had stumbled into something far more sinister than I could have imagined. The mall wasn't just haunted, it was a predator feeding off the trapped souls of those teenagers, using their eternal youth to fuel some dark, unnatural life. What followed was a nightmare of running and hiding through corridors that shifted and changed past storefronts that morphed into gaping MO, trying to swallow me whole. I could hear the trapped teenagers calling out to me, begging for help, but always Hadley and his cronies were right behind me. I don't know how I made it out, luck maybe, or perhaps some part of the mall itself decided to help me. All I know is that I found myself outside, just as dawn was breaking, gasping for air in the parking lot as the mall loomed behind me once again, looking like nothing more than an ordinary shopping center. I never went back. I quit my job that very day, ignoring the concerned questions from HR and the knowing smirk from Hadley when I handed in my uniform. But I couldn't just walk away, not knowing what I knew. I've spent the years since then trying to uncover the truth, to find a way to free those trapped souls. I've reached out to paranormal investigators, to journalists, to anyone who might believe my story. Most think I'm crazy, maybe I am, but sometimes when I drive past Oakwood Mall late at night, I see them, faces pressed against the darkened windows, silently pleading for help. And I know that somewhere inside, in a corridor trapped in 1989, a group of teenagers is still waiting to be set free. I don't know if I'll ever find a way to help them, but I do know this malls aren't just places for shopping anymore. Some of them hide secrets darker than we could ever imagine. And if you ever find yourself working the night shift, in one, pay attention to the shadows, listen for the whispers, because you never know when you might stumble upon a truth that will change your life forever. I never thought I'd be grateful for my severe peanut allergy, but on that sweltering July afternoon it saved my life. The summer I turned 16, I landed what I thought was a dream job, live in nanny for the prestigious Hamilton family. Little did I know I was stepping into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. The Hamiltons seemed perfect on paper. Richard, a successful lawyer, and his wife Elena, a renowned pediatrician, had two adorable children, 7-year-old Lily and 5-year-old Max. They lived in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of town, Compel, with a pool, tennis court, and meticulously manicured gardens. When I arrived lugging my suitcase up the grand front steps, I felt like I'd walked onto the set of a movie. Elena answered the door, all perfect smile and designer sundress. "You must be Sarah," she said, ushering me inside. "We're so glad you're here. The children have been so excited to meet you." As she gave me a tour of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way Elena's smile never quite reached her eyes, or the eerie silence that seemed to permeate the massive home, where were the sounds of playing children, of a lived-in family space. I met the kids at dinner that night. Lily and Max were adorable, but unnervingly well behaved. They sat ramrod straight in their chairs, answering their parents' questions in quiet, polite voices. Not once did they squabble or complain about the elaborate meal set before them, a far cry from the chaotic family dinners I was used to. It was during dessert that the first truly strange thing happened. Elena had made a beautiful peanut butter mousse, and as she was serving it, I mentioned my allergy. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, looking genuinely distressed. "I completely forgot. Let me get you something else." As she hurried to the kitchen, I noticed Richard and the children exchange a look. It was quick, barely a flicker, but in that moment I saw something cold and calculating in their eyes that sent a chill down my spine. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. On the surface, everything seemed normal. I took the kids to the pool, helped them with summer reading, played endless games of hide and seek in the massive house. But underneath there was a constant undercurrent of unease. Little things kept nagging at me, the way Lily and Max never seemed to argue or misbehave, even when no adults were around. The locked room in the east wing that Elena told me was just storage, but I often heard strange noises coming from the fact that in all my time there I never saw the kids interact with friends their own age. And then there were the nightmares. Every night I'd jolt awake, heart pounding, convinced I'd heard screams echoing through the house. But when I'd creep out to investigate, all would be silent. And still, it was about a month into my stay when I stumbled upon the truth. I was in the laundry room, sorting through the kids' clothes, when I found it, a small notebook tucked into the pocket of Max's jeans. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. Page after page of childish handwriting detailing horrific acts, experiments. The notebook called them tests of endurance, of pain tolerance, of psychological breaking points, and accompanying each entry were clinical notes in an adult's hand analyzing the results. I was so engrossed in the nightmare before me that I didn't hear the footsteps approaching. It wasn't until a shadow fell over me that I realized I wasn't alone. Find something interesting, Sarah. Richard's voice was calm, almost amused, but when I looked up, his eyes were as cold and dead as a shark's. I scrambled to my feet, the notebook clutched to my chest. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What have you been doing to those children?" Richard's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Not to them, Sarah, with them, for them. We're making them better, you see, stronger, superior." As he spoke, Elena and the children appeared in the doorway. Lily and Max were smiling, but there was nothing childlike in their expressions anymore. They looked hungry. "We had such high hopes for you, Sarah," Elena sighed, shaking her head. "We thought you might be suitable to join our little family, to help us with our great work. But it seems," Richard continued, taking a step towards me, "that you're not quite what we're looking for after all." I ran through the winding corridors of the mansion, up staircases, and down hallways, the sound of pursuit close behind me. I could hear Lily and Max giggling, as if this was all some grand game to them. I ended up in the kitchen, frantically searching for a weapon, a phone, anything that might help me. And that's when I saw it, the jar of peanut butter on the counter, left out from lunch earlier. An idea struck me, born of desperation and fear. I grabbed the jar and a knife, smearing the peanut butter over my arms and face. Then I turned to face my pursuers. The Hamiltons burst into the kitchen, Richard and the lead, but they skidded to a stop when they saw me, their eyes widening in surprise. And yes, fear. "Don't come any closer," I warned, holding out my peanut butter covered arms. "One touch and I go into anaphylactic shock. Is that the kind of mess you want to deal with?" It was a bluff, of course. My allergy was severe, but not quite that bad. But they didn't know that. For a long moment we stood there in a tense standoff. Then slowly Richard backed away, "Let her go," he said to the others, his voice tight, with barely contained rage. "She's not worth the risk." I didn't wait to be told twice. I ran from that house, and didn't stop until I was miles away, collapsing on the side of the road where a kind stranger found me and called the police. The aftermath was a blur of police interviews and psych evaluations. The Hamiltons, of course, denied everything. The notebook had vanished, and without it, it was my word against theirs. Pillars of the community versus a teenage girl with an overactive imagination. In the end, nothing came of it. The Hamiltons moved away soon after to some other unsuspecting town, where they could continue their work in peace. Sometimes I wonder about Lily and Max, about what kind of monsters they're growing up to be under their parents' twisted guidance. As for me, I still have nightmares about that summer, about cold eyes and childish giggles, and the sound of footsteps chasing me through endless hallways. I can't look at a jar of peanut butter without feeling sick, but mostly I think about how close I came to becoming part of their family, how if it hadn't been for my allergy, I might have ended up as just another one of their experience, another victim of the Hamiltons' pursuit of perfection. So if you're ever looking for a summer job, be careful. That perfect family in the big house might not be what they seem, and sometimes the real monsters are the ones hiding in plain sight behind picket fences and perfect smiles. The moment I laid eyes on my new neighbor, I knew something wasn't quite right. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a feeling of prickling at the back of my neck whenever he was around. If only I'd trusted that instinct sooner, maybe I could have prevented the nightmare that was about to unfold. It was a crisp autumn day when he moved in next door. I was raking leaves in my front yard when the moving truck pulled up. As I watched, a man stepped out of the PA passenger side, tall, well-dressed, with a smile that seemed a touch too wide to be natural. He spotted me and waved, crossing the lawn with an easy grace. "Hello there, I'm James, your new neighbor." I introduced myself, trying to ignore the unease that settled in my stomach. As we shook hands, his grip was firm, almost painfully so, and his hand was ice cold despite the warm afternoon sun. Over the next few weeks, James proved to be the model neighbor. He kept his lawn immaculate, always greeted everyone with that too wide smile, and even brought over a hamade pie when he first moved in. But there was always something off about him, the way his eyes never seemed to blink quite enough, the way neighborhood pets would go silent. And still, when he walked by the way, he was always watching. It started small. At first, Mrs. Johnson's cat went missing, then the Thompsons' dog. People chalked it up to coyotes or just bad luck, but I couldn't shake the memory of seeing James out in his backyard late one night, digging. When I'd called out to ask what he was doing, he'd looked up with those unblinking eyes and said, "Just a bit of late-night gardening. Sleep well, neighbor." Then people started to change. Sarah from across the street, who'd always been a bit of a gossip, suddenly became withdrawn and quiet. When I ran into her at the grocery store, she wouldn't meet my eyes, just mumbled something about being in a rush and hurried away, but not before I noticed the strange circular mark on the back of her neck, just below her hairline. I started paying closer attention. After that, I noticed how James seemed to be everywhere in the neighborhood, always engaged in conversation with someone. And after each interaction, that person would change, become quieter, more reserved. Their eyes would take on the same glassy, unblinking quality. James. One night, unable to sleep, I saw James leaving his house at 2 a.m. Without really thinking about it, I decided to follow him. He walked with purpose through the silent streets, eventually coming to the old community center at the edge of our neighborhood. It had been abandoned for years, scheduled for demolition, but never quite getting there. James unlocked the door and slipped inside. I crept up to a dirty window, peering through a gap in the grime. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The main room of the community center had been transformed. Strange symbols covered the walls and floor, glowing faintly in the darkness, and in the center of it all was James. Surrounded by our neighbors, they stood in a circle, swaying slightly, their eyes fixed on James as he raised his arms and began to chant in a language I'd never heard before. As I watched, horrified, James' face began to change. His features seemed to melt and shift, revealing something underneath that was decidedly not human. Tentacles writhed where his mouth should be, and his eyes multiplied, covering his face in a sea of blinking orbs. I must have made a sound, a gasp or a whimper, because suddenly every eye in the room turned to the window. To me, I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, heart pounding, lungs burning. I could hear something behind me, a slithering, squelching sound that was gaining ground fast. Just as I reached my front door, fumbling with my keys, I felt something cold and wet wrap around my ankle. I kicked out blindly, feeling my foot connect with something soft. There was a hiss of pain, and the grip on my ankle loosened, just enough for me to wrench free and tumble through my door, slamming it shut behind me. For a long moment, I just sat there on my floor, gasping for breath, listening to the sound of something inhuman scratching at my door. Eventually, it went away, but I didn't move until dawn began to break the next day. Everything seemed normal. James was out watering his lawn, waving cheerfully to passers by. My changed neighbors went about their routines as if nothing had happened, but now I could see the truth behind the facade, the slight iridescent sheen into their skin when the light hit it just right the way. They moved just a touch too fluid to be natural. I spent the next week in a panic, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't go to the police, who would believe me? And even if they did, what could they do against whatever James was? I thought about running, but the idea of leaving everyone I knew in the clutches of that thing was unbearable. In desperation, I turned to the internet, searching for anything that might help me understand what I was dealing with. It was there on an obscure forum dedicated to paranormal encounters that I found a glimmer of hope. The post was old, nearly a decade old, but it described something eerily similar to what was happening in my neighborhood. A friendly new neighbor, strange changes in the community, glimpses of something inhuman. But the key difference was that in this story, someone had found a way to stop it. The solution was almost too simple to be believed. Salt. Apparently, whatever these creatures were, they couldn't cross a line of pure salt. It disrupted their ability to maintain their human form, revealing their true nature. Armed with this knowledge and more bulk-sized containers of salt than I care to admit, I formulated a plan. It was risky, potentially suicidal, but it was the only chance I had to save my neighborhood, and possibly the world, from whatever James and his kind were planning. The next community barbecue, something James had suggested, and everyone had enthusiastically agreed to, was my opportunity. As everyone gathered in the park laughing and talking with that eerie, glassy-eyed cheer, I got to work under the guise of setting up decorations. I managed to create a massive circle of salt around the entire gathering. James was at the center, holding court with that too wide smile, completely oblivious to what I was doing. With the last of the salt poured, I took a deep breath and stepped into the circle. "Hey, James," the first called out, my voice surprisingly steady despite my racing heart. "I think it's time you showed everyone who you really are." James turned to me, his smile faltering for just a moment. "Whatever do you mean, neighbor?" he asked, but I could see the panic in his eyes. "I mean this," I said, and pulled out a water gun filled with salt water. Before he could react, I sprayed him full in the face. The effect was immediate and horrifying. "James, your skin began to bubble and melt, his features twisting and morphing into that tentacled, many-eyed monstrosity I'd seen in the community center. Around us, the other changed neighbors began to transform as well, their human disguises dissolving to reveal writhing alien forms. Chaos erupted. The few unchanged neighbors screamed and tried to run, only to find themselves trapped by the salt circle. The transformed creatures, including the thing that had been James, lunged for me, tentacles flailing, but they couldn't touch me. Every time they tried to cross the salt line, their bodies seemed to hit an invisible wall, recoiling in pain. I stood my ground, salt gun at the ready, as sirens began to wail in the distance. What followed was a nightmare of flashing lights, men in hazmat suits, and more questions than I could possibly answer. The government, it turned out, had been tracking these creatures for years, always one step behind my salt trap, had finally given them the break they needed. In the aftermath, our neighborhood was quarantined for months. Those who had been changed were taken away for treatment, though I have my doubts about what that really meant. The rest of us were sworn to secret our silence, bought with threats and bribes in equal measure. Life eventually returned to some semblance of normalcy, but I know I'll never be the same. I still wake up in cold sweats. The memory of James' true form burned into my mind. I keep salt by every door and window, a habit I don't think I'll ever break. And sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear something slithering outside, testing for weaknesses, waiting for its chance to return. Because if there's one thing I learned from this nightmare, it's that the monsters are real. They're out there wearing human faces, waiting for their chance to strike. So the next time you meet a new neighbor who seems just a little too perfect, a little too friendly, well, maybe keep some salt handy, just in case. The throbbing in my head was the first thing I noticed as consciousness slowly returned. My mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton, and there was a metallic taste on my tongue that I couldn't quite place. I tried to open my eyes, but the lids felt heavy, uncooperative. When I finally managed to pry them open, I was met with darkness so complete it took me a moment to realize my eyes were actually open. Panic set in as I tried to move, only to find my wrists and ankles bound tightly to what felt like a chair. The rough texture of rope bit into my skin as I struggled, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Where was I? How did I get here? The last thing I remembered was leaving the bar after a night out with friends. Had I been drugged, kidnapped? As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I began to make out vague shapes around me. I was in a small room, maybe a basement or a storage unit. The air was stale and damp with an underlying scent that made my stomach churn, a sickly sweet odor that reminded me of decaying fruit. Suddenly a light flickered on overhead the harsh fluorescent glare, making me wise. As my vision cleared, I found myself staring into the face of a man I'd never seen before. He was middle-aged, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second glance. But his eyes were cold, calculating, filled with a curiosity that sent chills down my spine. "You're awake," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. I was beginning to worry I'd miscalculated the dosage. I tried to speak, but my tongue felt thick and unresponsive. All I could manage was a weak groan. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't worry, the effects will wear off soon. In the meantime, let me introduce myself. My name is Dr. Elliot Parsons, and you, my dear, are about to become part of something truly extraordinary." As he spoke, he moved around the room, checking various machines and monitors I hadn't noticed before. They beeped in word, displaying numbers and graphs I couldn't begin to understand. "You see," Dr. Parsons continued, "I've dedicated my life to unraveling the mysteries of human consciousness, the mind, the soul, what makes us who we are. And after years of research, I've made a breakthrough, a way to separate consciousness from the physical body." He paused, looking at me expectantly, as if waiting for me to be impressed. When I didn't respond, he frowned slightly and went on. "Of course, the scientific community laughed at my theories, called me a crackpot, a madman, but I'll show them, and you, my dear, will help me do it." As the drug's effects began to wear off, fear gave way to anger. "You're insane," I spat out, my voice hoarse. "Let me go, or I swear out you'll—" What? Dr. Parsons interrupted, his tone still eerily calm. "Scream. No one can hear you down here. Call for help. Your phone is long gone. No, I'm afraid you're going to be my guest for quite some time." He turned away, fiddling with one of the machines. "Now, let's begin, shall we?" What followed was a nightmare beyond anything I could have imagined. Dr. Parsons attached electrodes to my head, inserted IVs into my arms. He spoke constantly as he worked, explaining his theories, his methods, his grand vision. But I barely heard him, too consumed by terror and the growing certainty that I was going to die in this room. And then, just as I thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. I felt a jolt, like an electric shock, running through my entire body. And suddenly I was outside myself. I could see my body still strapped to the chair, eyes wide and unblinking, but I was also floating above it. Formless, weightless. Dr. Parsons was ecstatic. "It worked," he cried, staring at a monitor that showed two distinct brainwave patterns. "Your ES has been successfully separated from your body. Can you hear me? Can you communicate?" I tried to speak, to move, but in this disembodied state, I had no way to make myself heard or seen. I was trapped, a silent observer to my own torment. Days passed, or maybe it was weeks. Time lost all meaning as Dr. Parsons continued his experiments. He would return my consciousness to my body, only to rip it away again. Each time the process became more painful, more terrifying, and each time it became harder to find my way back. I began to lose pieces of myself, memories, emotions, the very essence of who I was. All of it seemed to be slipping away. I could feel myself fragmenting, parts of my consciousness scattering like dust in the wind. Dr. Parsons, for his part, grew more manic with each passing day. His excitement gave way to frustration as he failed to achieve the breakthroughs he'd hoped for. He would rant for hours about the narrow-mindedness of his peers, about the greatness that awaited him once his work was recognized. I don't know how long this went on, but eventually something changed during one of the separations. As I floated in that strange formless state, I felt something else, a presence vast and incomprehensible. It seemed to fill the entire room, the entire world, and it spoke to me not in words, exactly more like concepts, ideas that bloomed directly in what passed from my mind. In this state, it told me of realms beyond our own, of consciousnesses so vast and alien that merely brushing against them could shatter a human psyche. It told me that what Dr. Parsons was doing was dangerous, that he was tearing holes in the fabric of reality, holes that things from the other side could slip through, things that should never exist in our world. And then, to my horror, it showed me I saw creatures of shadow and flame, writhing masses of tentacles and eyes, beings of pure energy that pulsed with malevolent intent. They were pressing against the weakened barriers of our reality-seeking entry, and with each of Dr. Parsons' unexperiments, those barriers grew thinner. The presence left me with a choice. It could help me stop Dr. Parsons, seal the breaches he'd created, but the price would be high. I would have to sacrifice a part of myself, become something not quite human, to wield the power needed to end this. In that moment, faced with the horrors I'd seen, the choice was easy. What happened next is difficult to describe. I felt myself expand, my consciousness merging with something vast and ancient. Knowledge flooded into me, knowledge of the universe, of realities beyond our own, of powers that defied human understanding. When Dr. Parsons initiated the next separation, he got more than he bargained for. My consciousness didn't just leave my body, it exploded outward, filling the room with a blinding light. I could see the holes in reality, now ragged tears leaking otherworldly energies into our world. Dr. Parsons screamed, finally faced with the consequences of his actions. He could see them too now, the creatures pressing against the weakened barriers. Hungry for entry with my newfound power, I began to seal the breaches. It was agonizing work, like trying to sew up wounds in the very fabric of the universe. But slowly, painfully, I closed them off one by one. As the last breach sealed, I turned my attention to Dr. Parsons. He was on his knees, babbling incoherently, his mind shattered by what he'd seen. Part of me wanted to destroy him for what he'd done to me, for the danger he'd put the entire world in, but in the end I chose mercy. I wiped his mind clean, erasing all knowledge of his experiments and the horrors he'd unleashed. Returning to my body was like squeezing into a suit several sizes too small. I felt compressed, limited, only a fraction of what I had become. But I knew I couldn't maintain that expanded state. The human mind isn't meant to contain such vastness. I destroyed Dr. Parsons' equipment, erased his data, removed every trace of his terrible experiments, then using the last of my enhanced abilities, I freed myself and made my way back to the world above. Months have passed since that day. On the surface, my life has returned to normal, but I know I'll never truly be the same. There are moments when I can feel it, that vastness just beyond my reach, the knowledge of realities beyond our own. And sometimes in the dark of night, I wonder, did I truly seal all the breaches? Or are there still holes out there hidden and waiting? Are there things slipping through even now, unseen and unknown? I don't have the answers, but I remain vigilant, always watching, always ready, because I've seen what lies beyond the veil of our reality. And I know that the barriers between worlds are far thinner than any of us would like to believe. Rusty key felt unnaturally heavy in my hand as I stood before the OI. This moment, for weeks since her funeral, but I couldn't put it off any longer. The house was to be sold, and it felt to me to sort through the remnants of her life. With a deep breath, I slid the key into the lock and turned it, wincing at the loud click that echoed through the empty house. The door creaked open, revealing untouched for decades dust ms, and in the thin shaft of light from the single window and the musty smell of aged paper and forgotten memories, assaulted senses, fumbled for the light, switching little leaf casting long shadows across piles of boxes and old furniture. As I picked my way through the clutter, the particular box caught my eye. Unlike the others, it wasn't cardboard or wood, but a sleek black metal container with an intricate lock. I'd never seen it before, and curiosity got the better of me. Kneeling beside it, I noticed a small envelope taped to the top, addressed to me in my grandmother's elegant handwriting. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope and began to read. My dear, I'm no longer with you. I'm sorry for the burden I'm about to place on your shoulders, but you're the only one I can trust. With inside this box, you'll find the truth about our family, a truth I've kept hidden for over 60 years. It's a dangerous secret, one that has haunted me every day of my life, but it's time you knew. The key is taped to the back of this letter. Be careful, my love, once you open this box, there's no going back. All my love, Grandma. My heart raced as I peeled the small key from the back of the letter. It felt wrong, somehow too warm, almost alive in my hand, but my curiosity overpowered my apprehension, and I inserted it into the lock. The moment the box opened, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. A wave of cold air rushed out, carrying with it a scent that made my head spin. Something ancient and wrong, like decay and ozone, and something I couldn't quite place. Inside the box was a single item, a leather-bound journal, its cover worn and cracked with age. As I lifted the journal, a photograph slipped out and fluttered to the floor. I picked it up, and my blood ran cold. It showed my grandmother, looking much younger, standing next to a man I'd never seen before. But it wasn't the man that caught my attention, it was what loomed behind them, a shape blurred and ind distinct, but unmistakably inhuman. Multiple limbs, too many eyes, a form that seemed to shift and change even in the static image. With shaking hands, I opened the journal and began to read. What I found inside shattered everything I thought I knew about my family, about reality itself. The journal detailed my grandmother's involvement with a secret society dedicated to studying and containing entities from beyond our reality. These beings, which the society called Outer Ones, existed in dimensions parallel to our own, occasionally slipping through weaknesses in the fabric of space-time. My grandmother had been recruited fresh out of college, her brilliant mind and unwavering curiosity making her an ideal candidate. At first, she'd been thrilled the chance to explore the unknown, to push the boundaries of human knowledge. But as she delved deeper into the society's work, she began to understand the true horror of what they were dealing with. The Outer Ones were beyond human comprehension, their very presence warping the laws of physics and sanity. Alike, some were merely curious about our world, while others harbored intentions far more sinister. The society's job was to study these entities, to find ways to communicate with the benign ones and repel the dangerous. But something had gone wrong, horribly catastrophically wrong. In the summer of 1962, the Society had attempted to open a controlled portal to the realm of the outer ones. My grandmother had been part of the team, her mathematical skills crucial to the calculations needed to stabilize the breach, but they had underestimated the power. They were dealing with the portal had opened wider than intended, and something had come. Through something ancient and vast and hungry, in the chaos that followed, most of the team had been killed or driven mad. My grandmother had barely escaped with her life, and her sanity intact. The Society had managed to close the portal, but not before the entity had latched onto our reality. It couldn't fully manifest, but it could influence things from the periphery, and it had chosen my grandmother as its anchor. For decades she had lived with this terrible knowledge, always feeling the entity's presence at the edges of her perception. She had left the Society, tried to live a normal life, but the entity followed her. It whispered to her in her dreams, showed her visions of realities that no human was meant to see, and now with her death it had latched onto me. As I read the final pages of the journal, I became aware of a presence in the attic with me, not a physical presence, but a weight in the air, a sense of being watched by countless unseen eyes. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen and wide, taking on shapes that hurt my mind to look at directly. I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding, but it was too late. I could feel it now. The entity that had haunted my grandmother for so long, it was aware of me, curious about this new consciousness it could touch. In that moment, I understood the true weight of the burden my grandmother had passed to me. This wasn't just knowledge, it was a responsibility, a duty to keep this thing contained, to prevent it from fully entering our world. As if in response to my thoughts, I felt a surge of something, not quite emotion, not quite thought, but a complex blend of both. The entity was communicating with me in its alien, incomprehensible way. I saw flashes of other worlds, of realities so far removed from our own that merely glimpsing them threatened to break my mind. But mixed with the terror was an undercurrent of wonder. The entity was curious, eager to learn about our world through me. And despite my fear, I found myself curious too. What could I learn from this being? What secrets of the universe might it reveal? I knew then that my life would never be the same. Like my grandmother before me, I was now a guardian of a terrible secret, a bridge between worlds that were never meant to touch. I would have to learn to live with this presence, always at the edges of my awareness, to interpret its alien thoughts and keep it from influencing our world too much. As the full weight of this realization settled over me, I felt a strange calm descend. This was my purpose, now my legacy. I carefully repacked the journal and photograph into the metal box, locking it securely. I would find a safer place for it, somewhere the curious or unsuspecting wouldn't stumble upon it. As I left the attic, closing and locking the door behind me, I felt the entity's presence settle into the back of my mind, a constant alien companion that would be with me for the rest of my life. I stepped out of the house into the bright sunlight, blinking as my eyes adjusted. The world looked the same as it always had. People going about their daily lives, unaware of the realities that existed alongside our own. But I saw it differently now. In every shadow, every unexplained movement at the corner of my eye, I sensed the potential for something more. My grandmother's burden was now mine, and though it terrified me, a part of me thrilled at the possibilities it presented. What wonders and horrors would I witness in the years to come? What role would I play in the grand cosmic dance between our world and the realms beyond? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain: life would never be ordinary. Again, the first time I saw my doppelganger, I thought I was losing my mind. It was just a glimpse, a fleeting reflection in a store window as I walked home from work. But it was enough to stop me dead in my tracks, heart pounding, because the face staring back at me wasn't quite right. It was me, but wrong. The eyes were too wide, the smile too sharp, and as I watched frozen in disbelief, it winked at me before disappearing. I told myself it was just stress, lack of sleep, maybe the beginnings of a migraine. But deep down I knew something wasn't right, and over the next few weeks that feeling only grew stronger. It started small. At first, things in my apartment would be slightly out of place. A book I swore I'd left on the coffee table, now on the shelf. My toothbrush on the wrong side of the sink. Nothing major, nothing I couldn't explain away as simple forgetfulness. But it kept happening more and more frequently. Then came the texts and emails, friends asking about conversations we'd never had, coworkers mentioning meetings I'd attended but had no memory of. Each time I'd laugh it off, make some excuse about being scatterbrained. But the fear was growing, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. It was my best friend Sarah who finally confronted me about it. We were having coffee, and she kept giving me these strange looks. Okay, what's going on with you? She finally asked. You've been acting weird for weeks, and don't try to deny it. I know you better than anyone. I wanted to tell her everything about the reflection, the strange occur, yes, the growing sense that I was somehow being Replaced, but how could I, without sounding completely insane? I'm fine, I lied, forcing a smile. Just been stressed at work, that's all. Sarah didn't look convinced. But she let it drop as we said goodbye. She hugged me tightly. You know you can tell me anything, right? She whispered, no matter how crazy it might seem. If only I'd taken her up on that offer, maybe things would have turned out differently. But I was too scared, too confused to reach out for help, and so I faced what came next alone. It was a Tuesday night, when everything came to a head. I was working late, the office empty and quiet around me. As I gathered my things to leave, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, and there it was, my doppelganger, standing at the end of the hallway. This time, there was no mistaking it for a trick of the light or a stress-induced hallucination. It was solid, real, and utterly terrifying, because now I could see the differences clearly. Its skin was too pale, almost translucent. Its movements were fluid but wrong somehow, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. And its eyes, they were mine, but filled with a cold alien intelligence that made my blood run cold. Who are you? I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. What do you want? The thing that wore my face smiled, and I felt my skin crawl. When it spoke, its voice was mine, but distorted, like hearing myself through a bad phone connection. I am you, it said, or rather, I'm what you're going to become. I'm your upgrade, your evolution, isn't it? Wonderful. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. You're not real, I said, more to convince myself than anything. This isn't happening. The doppelganger smile widened, showing too many teeth. Oh, but I am real, more real than you can imagine, and it's time for you to step aside and let the new version take over. It took a step towards me, and I ran through the dark office, down the stairs, out into the night. I didn't stop until I was blocks away, gasping for breath, my legs shaking. When I finally made it home, I locked every door and window, drew all the curtains, but I knew deep down that it wouldn't be enough. Whatever this thing was, wherever it had come from, blacks and walls wouldn't keep it out. I spent the night huddled on my couch, jumping at every sound, every shadow. When dawn finally broke, I felt a moment of relief. Surely in the light of day, everything would make sense again. But as I stumbled to the bathroom, exhausted and on edge, I realized the nightmare was far from over, because there, standing in front of my mirror, was the doppelganger only. Now it looked even more like me. The inhuman pallor was gone, replaced by my exact skin tone. Its movements were smoother, more natural. It turned to me, and I saw my own surprised expression mirrored perfectly on its face. Oh, it said, sounding genuinely startled, you're still here. I thought the transition would be complete by now. What transition? I asked, my voice shaking. What are you talking about? The doppelganger sighed, a perfect imitation of my own exasperated exhale. It's complicated, it said, but essentially I'm your replacement, a better version of you, created to seamlessly take over your life. As it spoke, I noticed more changes. Its voice was now indistinguishable from mine. Even the little scar on my chin from a childhood accident was there, perfectly replicated. But why? I asked, struggling to comprehend the insanity of the situation. Who created you? What's the point of all this? The doppelganger shrugged, the gesture so familiar it made my stomach churn. I don't know all the details, it admitted. I just know that I'm part of something bigger, an experiment maybe. Or perhaps the next step in human evolution. All I know is that I'm here to replace you, and once the process is complete, you'll cease to be the casual way. It discussed my eraser, sent a chill down my spine. And if I refuse, I challenged, trying to sound braver. Then I felt, if I fight this for a moment, something like pity flashed across the doppelganger face. You can try, it said softly, but it won't change anything. The process has already begun. Haven't you noticed the memory gaps, the lost time? That's me, slowly taking over. Soon there won't be enough of you left to fight. As it spoke, I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. Memories flickered through my mind, conversations I didn't remember, having places I'd never been, but somehow recognized. The lines between myself and this imposter were blurring, and I didn't know how to stop it. Please, I begged, not even sure what I was asking for. There has to be another way. The doppelganger stepped closer, its expression a perfect mirror of concern. It reached out, and I was too shocked to pull away. As it laid a hand on my cheek, its touch was warm, alive, utterly human. I'm sorry, it said, and I believed it. I truly am, but this is how it has to be. Don't worry, though, I'll take good care of your life, your friends, your family. They won't even know the difference. As it spoke, I felt myself fading. It was like being pulled underwater, the world growing distant and muffled. I tried to fight it, to hold on to myself, but it was like grasping at smoke. The last thing I saw was my own face, watching me with a mixture of fascination and sadness. As I slipped away, I don't know how long I was gone. Time had no meaning in that formless void, but somehow, impossibly, I clawed my way back. It was like swimming up from the depths of a dark ocean, fighting against a current that wanted to drag me back down. When I opened my eyes, I was in my bed. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but then I saw the note on my nightstand, written in my own handwriting. I don't know how you did it, but you're stronger than we Thought this isn't over. The process may have stalled, but if we'll resume, enjoy your reprieve while it lasts. I sit here, now writing this down, trying to make sense of what's happened, what's still happening. I don't know who to trust, who to turn to. For all I know, everyone in my life has already been replaced. And I'm the last original human left. All I know is that I'm not giving up without a fight. Whatever this thing is, wherever it came from, I won't let it erase me. I'll find a way to stop it, to reverse this process it talked about. But a part of me wonders, how will I know if I've succeeded? How can I be sure that the person writing these words, thinking these thoughts, is really me? Or am I already gone, nothing more than an echo fading into oblivion? As my replacement lives my life, I don't have the answers, but I'll keep fighting, keep searching for the truth, because the alternative, surrendering to this slow, insidious erasure, is unthinkable. If you're reading this, be careful, watch for the little inconsistencies, the moments of lost time, because you never know when your upgrade might be coming for you. And if you see someone who looks just like you smiling a smile that's not quite right, run. And don't look back. I never thought a simple house-sitting job would lead me to uncover a decades-old mystery. But that's exactly what happened last summer. It all started when my neighbor Mrs. Callahan asked me to look after her place while she visited her sister in Florida. Mrs. Callahan was a sweet old lady who'd lived in the same Victorian house for over 50 years. I'd always admired the place from afar, its intricate woodwork, the wraparound porch, the tower room with its circular window. So when she offered to pay me to essentially live in a piece of history for 2 weeks, I jumped at the chance. The first few days were uneventful. I watered the plants, fed the cat, and spent my evenings exploring the house's nooks and crannies. It was on the 4th night that things took a turn for the strange. I was in the attic, rummaging through old boxes out of sheer curiosity, when I found it, a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. At first I hesitated to open it. It felt like an invasion of privacy, reading someone else's private thoughts, but curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped it open to a random page. The date at the top read June 15th. 1972. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, as if the writer had been in a rush. It's happening again, the noises in the walls, the whispers in the dark. I thought it was over, that we'd sealed it away for good, but it's found a way back. God help us all. A chill ran down my spine as I read those words. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the ramblings of an overactive imagination. But as I continued to read, flipping back and forth through the journal, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The journal belonged to a woman named Eleanor, who I assumed was Mrs. Callahan's mother. She wrote about a presence in the house, something dark and malevolent that had tormented her family for generations. According to Eleanor, it had started with her great-grandmother, who had brought something back with her from a trip to Egypt, a small statue of a jackal-headed god. At first the family had dismissed the strange occurrences as coincidence, objects moving on their own cold spots in rooms, the feeling of being watched. But as time went on, things escalated. Eller wrote of night terrors so vivid they left physical marks, of whispered voices urging violence, of shadows that moved against the laws of nature. The entries became more frantic as I read on. Eleanor described rituals performed to contain the entity, consultations with psychics and occultists. The final entry, dated October 31st, 1973, simply read, "We've done it. The binding is complete. May God forgive us for what we had to do." I closed the journal, my hands shaking. It was just a story, I told myself, the product of an overactive imagination, or maybe early onset dementia. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the old house, every shadow cast by moonlight through the windows seemed sinister. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I'd let an old journal spook me. But in the early hours of the morning, as I finally began to drift off, I heard it, a whisper, so faint I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Find it, free us." I bolted upright, my heart pounding. The room was empty still, but the air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. And there in the corner of my eye I saw something move, a shadow darker then the surrounding darkness, slithering across the wall. I didn't sleep again that night. The next day, I threw myself into research. I scoured the internet for any information about the house's history, about Eleanor and her family. What I found only deepened the mystery. There were gaps in the property records, periods where the house seemed to have no official owner, and the Callahan family had a troubling history of mental illness and mysterious deaths. As night fell, I found myself back in the attic, searching for I didn't even know what. More journals. The statue Eleanor had mentioned some kind of proof, that I wasn't going crazy, what I found was a hidden compartment behind a loose floorboard. Inside was a small wooden box, intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a statue no bigger than my palm. It depicted a figure with the body of a man and the head of a jackal, Anubis, the Egyptian god of death. As I lifted it from the box, I felt a jolt like static electricity, but stronger, and in that moment I heard the whisper again, and free as the temperature in the room plummeted, the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, to move with a life of their own, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that I had made a terrible mistake. What followed was a night of pure terror. The entity Eleanor had written about was real, and it was awake. Shadows danced on the walls, taking on monstrous shapes. Objects flew across rooms of their own accord, and always there were the whispers, promising power, threatening pain, begging for freedom. I tried to leave, to run from the house, but every door I approached slammed shut, every window refused to budge. I was trapped alone with something ancient and hungry. As dawn approached, I found myself huddled in the tower room, the statue clutched to my chest. I didn't want to touch it, but some instinct told me that letting it go would be even worse. Through the circular window I could see the sky beginning to lighten, and then, just as I thought I couldn't take any more, there was a new voice, clear, calm, cutting through the chaotic whispers. "You have to finish it." I turned, half expecting to see a ghost, but there was no spectral figure, no visual manifestation, just the voice somehow inside my head and all around me at once. "Who are you?" I asked, my own voice hoarse from hours of fear. "Eleanor," the voice replied. "We didn't seal it away. Not completely. We couldn't bear to destroy it, to sever the connection entirely. That was our mistake, but you can fix it. You can end this once and for all." How I asked. Desperation making me willing to believe, to try anything. The voice Eleanor told me what to do. It was simple, really almost anticlimactic. After the night of terror I'd endured, all I had to do was break the statue. At the exact moment the first ray of sunlight touched it, as the sky outside grew brighter, I positioned myself by the window. The statue felt heavier than it should, and I could feel it vibrating slightly in my hands. The shadows in the room writhed and pulsed, and the whispers grew to a fever pitch. The moment the sun crested the horizon, I brought the statue down hard on the window sill. It shattered with a sound like breaking glass, but 1,000 times louder. There was a flash of light, so bright it left me seeing spots, and a scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then silence, blessed absolute silence. When my vision cleared, I found myself alone in a perfectly ordinary the oppressive atmosphere was gone. The shadows were just shadows again. Even the broken pieces of the statue had vanished, as if they'd never existed. I spent the rest of Mrs. Callahan's vacation in the days going through the motions of house-sitting, while trying to process what had happened. When she returned, I half expected her to mention something, to give some indication that she knew about the house's dark history, but she just thanked me for taking care of things, paid me, and that was that. I've never told anyone else this story who would believe me. Sometimes I'm not even sure I believe it myself, but on dark nights, when the wind howls and shadows seem to move in the corners of my room, I remember, and I wonder how many other houses out there are hiding secrets like Mrs. Callahan's, how many other ancient evils are waiting to be awakened or finally put to rest. The first night on my new job as a security guard at Oakwood Office Park, I thought the flickering light in the far corner of the parking lot was just faulty wiring. By the third night, I knew better. Something was out there in the darkness, something that didn't belong in our world, and it was getting closer. I had taken the job out of desperation, divorced, broke, and with a stack of overdue bills. The night shift position seemed like a godsend. The pay was decent, and the job description sounded easy enough. Patrol the grounds, check for any signs of intrusion or vandalism, and report any suspicious activity. Simple, right? The first 2 nights were uneventful. I made my rounds, sipping lukewarm coffee and listening to podcasts to stay awake. The office park was a ghost town. After hours, nothing but empty parking lots and dark windows reflecting the moonlight. It was boring, but I couldn't complain. Boring meant safe, and safe meant a steady paycheck. But on that third night, everything changed. It started with the light. I noticed it during my 2 a.m. round, a street lamp at the far end of the lot flickering erratically. I made a note to report it to maintenance in the morning and continued my patrol. But when I circled back an hour later, I noticed something odd. The light wasn't just flickering anymore. It seemed to be moving, swaying slightly as if buffeted by a strong wind, except there was no wind. The night was dead calm. I approached cautiously, my hand on the pepper spray at my belt. As I got closer, I realized the movement wasn't coming from the light itself, but from something underneath it, a shape indistinct in the darkness, writhing and pulsing like a mass of snakes. My breath caught in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to step closer, squinting to make out details. In the unreliable light, that's when I saw the eyes. Dozens of them gleaming in the darkness, all fixed on me. I sprinted back to the security office, and slammed the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I reached for the phone, ready to call the police. What would I tell them? That I saw a monster in the parking lot? I spent the rest of the night huddled in the office, watching the monitors, and jumping at every shadow. When dawn finally broke, I ventured out, half convinced I'd imagine the whole thing, but there under the now steady light of the street lamp was a large dark stain on the asphalt. It looked like oil, but it moved slightly when I approached, pulling away from my feet. As if alive, I reported the oil spill to my supervisor, careful not to mention anything about eyes or moving shadows. He promised to have someone check it out, but I could tell from his tone that it wasn't a priority. The next night, I came prepared. I'd spent the day researching, diving into forums about paranormal encounters and unexplained phenomena. Most of it seemed like nonsense, but a few things stuck out. Salt apparently was a deterrent against many supernatural entities. I felt ridiculous packing a container of Morton's in my bag, but it made me feel a little safer. The flickering light was back, more intense this time, and the shape beneath it had grown, spreading across the parking lot like a living oil slick. As I watched, frozen in horror, tendrils of darkness began to reach out, exploring the surrounding area with an unsettling intelligence. That's when I heard a sound so low it was more felt than heard, a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It made my teeth ache and my vision blur, and carried with it a sense of ancient alien hunger. I ran again, but this time to my car. I grabbed the salt and a flashlight, then forced myself to approach the writhing mass. The vibration grew stronger, and I could feel something pulling at my mind, urging me to step into the darkness, to let it envelop me. With shaking hands, I opened the salt container and began to pour, creating a circle around myself. The effect was immediate and shocking. Where the salt touched the dark substance, it hissed and recoiled, leaving clean patches of asphalt behind. Emboldened, I began to walk forward, pouring salt. As I went, the darkness retreated before me, the eyes blinking out one by one. The vibration in the air took on a different quality, no longer hungry, but angry. I worked through the night, using up every bit of salt I had. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, I had managed to push the entity, for lack of a better word, back to the far corner of the lot. It was contained, but not defeated. I could still see it pulsing there, waiting. Over the next few weeks, a pattern emerged. Each night the entity would try to spread, and each night I would push it back with salt. I started bringing larger quantities, buying it in bulk from a restaurant supply store. My car's trunk was filled with bags of the stuff. I tried to tell others, my supervisor, the day shift guards, even a few of the office workers who came in early, but no one believed me. They saw the salt, dismissed my talk of living shadows as some kind of prank or mental breakdown. I was written up twice for misuse of company resources and warned that any further incidents would result in termination. But I couldn't stop whatever this thing was. I was the only thing standing between it and what I didn't know, but I was certain it wasn't anything good. As the entity's attempts to spread became more aggressive, I started to notice changes in myself. I was losing weight, my skin taking on a gray, unhealthy pallor. I had trouble sleeping during the day, plagued by nightmares of endless darkness and watching eyes, and sometimes when I looked in the mirror, I could swear I saw something moving in the shadows behind me. It all came to a head on a moonless night in late October. I arrived for my shift to find the parking lot in darkness, every light extinguished, and there in the center of the vast empty space was the entity. It had grown massive, a roiling sea of darkness that seemed to devour the very air around it. I reached for my salt, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. Not this time. The vibration in the air was deafening now, and I could feel my sanity slipping as I stared into that vast, hungry void. That's when I saw them, people, dozens of them, walking slowly towards the darkness. Their eyes were blank faces, slack with a terrible ecstasy. I recognized some of them, office workers, other security guards, even my ex-wife, all of them drawn here, called by the entity for God knows what purpose. I tried to stop them, screaming warnings that fell on deaf ears. They walked past me as if I didn't exist, stepping into the darkness and vanishing without a sound. I watched in horror as the entity pulsed and grew with each person it consumed. In that moment, I knew what I had to do, what I should have done weeks ago. I ran to my car and grabbed every bag of salt I had been stealing myself. I charged towards the center of the darkness. The pull was immense, like trying to run upstream in a raging river. Each step was agony, the darkness clawing at my mind, showing me visions of power and knowledge beyond human comprehension. But I kept going. I reached the epicenter, where the darkness was so thick it was almost solid, and there I saw it, a tire, in reality itself, a portal to somewhere else, somewhere no human was ever meant to see. With the last of my strength, I upended the bags of salt directly into the portal. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The entity screamed a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days, and began to collapse in on itself. The Darkness rushed past me back towards the portal, taking with it all those it had consumed. I was the only one left in the parking lot. When it was over, the only one who remembered what had happened, the only one who knew how close our world had come to something terrible. I quit my job the next day, moved to a new city, started over. But I can't forget, and sometimes on dark nights, when the shadows seem to move of their own accord, I find myself reaching for the container of salt I always keep nearby, just in case. The old rotary phone in my grandmother's attic hadn't rung in decades, so when its shrill bell pierced the dusty silence that Saturday afternoon, I nearly fell off the rickety ladder I was perched on. I stared at the ancient black device, my heart pounding. It couldn't be ringing, it wasn't even connected to anything, and yet the sound persisted, demanding to be answered with trembling hands. I picked up the receiver. "Hello," I whispered, half expecting to hear nothing but static. Instead, a voice crackled through, distant and distorted, but unmistakably familiar. "Emily, is that you, sweetheart?" My breath caught in my throat. It was my grandmother's voice, my grandmother, who had passed away 3 months ago. "Grandma." I choked out, my mind reeling. "How this isn't possible." "Oh, honey," she said, her voice warm with affection. "There's so much that's possible that you don't know about. Listen carefully now. I don't have much time." What followed was a conversation that would change my life forever. My grandmother, it turned out, had been part of a secret society dedicated to communicating with the dead. The old phone was a relic of their experiments, a conduit between our world and what she called the other side. "We thought we'd closed the connection decades ago," she explained, "but something's happened. The veil between worlds is thinning, Emily, and not everything trying to cross over has good intentions." She gave me instructions, her voice growing fainter with each passing moment. I was to find an old book hidden in the attic, perform a ritual at midnight, and above all, not let anyone else answer the phone if it rang again. "Be careful, sweetheart," were her final words before the line went dead. "They're watching, they're always watching." I spent the rest of the day in a daze, trying to process what had happened. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a vivid hallucination, a product of grief and too much dust inhalation. But I couldn't shake the urgency in my grandmother's voice, the palpable fear underlying her words. As night fell, I found myself back in the attic. The book my grandmother had mentioned opened before me. Its pages were filled with strange symbols and incantations and languages I didn't recognize. The ritual she described was there, tucked between pages, about binding spirits and opening portals. At precisely midnight, I began. Candles lit, salt circle drawn, words chanted in a language that felt ancient and powerful on my tongue. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly the air in the attic began to change. It grew heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. The candle flames flickered and danced, casting writhing shadows on the walls, and then I saw them, shapes in the darkness, just at the edge of my vision. When I turned to look directly, they vanished, only to reappear in another corner. I could hear whispers too faint to make out words, but growing louder with each passing second. Fear clawed at my throat, but I forced myself to continue the ritual. My grandmother had warned me that stopping halfway could have dire consequences, so I pressed on, my voice shaking as I recited the final words. There was a flash of blinding light, a sound like reality itself tearing in. Then silence. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, the shadows retreated, and I was left alone in a perfectly ordinary attic, or so I thought. As my eyes readjusted to the dim light, I realized I wasn't alone after all. Sitting cross-legged in the center of my salt circle was a young woman. She looked to be about my age, with pale skin and dark hair that seemed to float around her, as if she were underwater. Her eyes, when they met mine, were completely black, while she said, her voice echoing strangely in the small space. "That was certainly interesting. I don't think your grandmother meant for you to bring me through, but here we are." I scrambled backward, my heart pounding. "What are you, the woman?" If that's what she was, smiled. It was not a comforting expression. "I'm many things, a traveler, an observer, a collector of stories. You can call me Lilith." Over the next hour, Lilith explained things to me. The ritual, it turned out, hadn't just thinned the veil between worlds, it had punched a hole right through it, and while it had allowed her to cross over, it had also opened the door for less benevolent entities. "Your grandmother's society knew what they were doing," Lilith said, examining the book with interest. "They had safeguards in place, ways to control what came through, but you, my dear, just flung the door wide open." As if to emphasize her point, a low moan echoed through the attic. The shadows in the corners began to deepen and move, taking on shapes that hurt my mind to look at. Directly Lilith sighed. "And here they come, the hungry ones, drawn to the light of living souls. We should probably do something about that, don't you think?" What followed was a crash course in interdimensional warfare. Lilith, for all her unsettling appearance and mannerisms, proved to be a knowledgeable ally. She taught me words of power that could repel the shadow creatures, showed me how to create barriers they couldn't cross. We worked through the night, sealing off the attic, and then moving through the rest of the house. I could feel the entities pressing against the barriers, testing for weaknesses. Their hunger was A palpable thing of void that longed to be filled with the warmth of the living. As dawn approached, we made our final stand in the living room. The entities had grown bolder, more desperate. I could see them now writhing masses of darkness, with too many limbs and eyes that glowed with an unholy light. One last push, Lilith, said her voice tight. With exertion we sealed the breach, send them back. Where they came from. The final incantation was the hardest. My throat was raw from hours of chanting, my mind reeling from the impossible things I'd seen. But as the first ray of sunlight crept through the window, I felt a surge of power. The words flowed from me clear and strong, and I felt the fabric of reality shift. There was a sound like 1,000 screaming voices, a flash of light that left me seeing spots, and then silence, blessed, ordinary silence. When my vision cleared, the shadow creatures were gone. So was Lilith. I was alone in my grandmother's living room, surrounded by overturned furniture and the acrid smell of smoke. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream, but the book remained, its pages now filled with notes in my own handwriting. And sometimes late at night, I could swear I heard whispers from the attic, the faint ringing of a phone that shouldn't work. I've moved out of my grandmother's house now, but I keep the book with me just in case, because I know the truth now. The veil between worlds is thin, and there are things out there in the darkness, things that hunger for the light of the living. And sometimes on quiet nights, when the shadows seem to move of their own accord, I find myself reaching for the book, ready to defend our world once again. Because someone has to stand guard against the darkness. Someone has to answer when that impossible phone rings again. I just hope that next time I'll be ready.